Good morning, everyone, and welcome into the annual assessment refresher and update. We'll do some introductions shortly, but let me just start off by welcoming all of you. Thank you for giving up your time to spend with us this morning. We've got 4 hours scheduled to take you through some exciting new content around mostly CA 2025, but then also giving you a little bit of an update too, in terms of the implementation process for CA 2025, the training office visits, and the electronic assessment tool. So just in terms of our process this morning, we're going to just each introduce ourselves. There are 4 of us that you're going to be spending a bit of time with this morning. I'll then take you through a little bit of the Zoom admin considerations. We'll then go through the objectives of the session before we then launch into the actual content itself. So I think because I've got my mic on and I am currently chatting to you, let me start off by just introducing myself to you. So my name is Graham O'Reilly. I'm a director of NSOA based here in a pretty chilly Cape Town at the moment. I am currently chairperson of the training program subcommittee for SAICA. I've been very involved in the CA 2025 process in terms of the working committee that dealt with CA 2025. So I've had a lot to do with the decisions around how CA 2025 works. And I'm going to hopefully be able to share some of that insight with you this morning. I also currently develop and deliver assessor training in the context of CA 2025 and have been doing numerous consultations with different training officers in terms of assisting them with the implementation of CA 2025. So I do keep my fingers crossed that I'm in a position to be able to share some of this knowledge with you, and I'll be dealing with certain elements of the presentation with you. I'd like to then hand over to Sandra to introduce herself as our second facilitator for the morning.
Thank you, Graham. Good morning. Similar to Graham, I am in a chilly Cape Town. I reside in Somerset West, working from home, and a mom to 2 girls who are on school holidays. So I'm hoping that they don't cause any interruptions today. I'm a director of ATCOR, and again, similar to Graham, I'm a member of the training program subcommittee and have been involved in the working group for CA 2025. I have assisted clients on the auditing side and in the commerce and industry side, or am assisting clients in the implementation of their training programs. So grappling with a lot of the practical issues of the implementation, and then also dealing with the theoretical considerations, keeping in mind conversations as part of the working group, and also conversations that we do still need to have around CA 2025 and how we're going to respond to practical issues. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing what we've learned along the way, what I've learned along the way with you in today's session, and I look forward to future conversations. Thank you, Graham.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Let me then hand over to my esteemed colleague from SAICA, Neo, just to give a short introduction from his side.
Good morning, Graham. Morning, everyone that's on today's session. Excited to be with everyone this morning. So I'm Neo Tsuletani. I'm the project director of training at SAICA. So I think from our side, in terms of CA 2025, it's a new journey. Everything that's been going in terms of the CA 2025, I think everybody has been asking the questions, and post-implementation, how everything has been going. So it's been, from my side, already coming to this side from SAICA, because I just started last month. It's been quite exciting, even seeing the background, how things are working and so forth. So I'm excited for today just to actually share more and actually unpack in terms of what's happening with CA 2025. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks very much, Neo. And then our final facilitator is Lunga. Let me just give Lunga an opportunity to introduce himself to all of you.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you are having a good morning. My name is Lunga Maponya. I'm the end user support manager for the electronic assessment tool. So I deal with all issues related to the onboarding on the EAT, as well as any technical issues that you might experience on the EAT itself. I work with the team to resolve any technical matters that you might have, or any questions that you might have related to the CA 2025 program.
Thanks very much, Lunga. Okay, so those are the 4 of us that you're going to be hearing from this morning. Just in terms of a little bit of Zoom admin, I mean, obviously, given the size of the group, we're not going to take live calls, so please no raised hands and turning on mics and videos. But we do want you to engage with us. So what we're going to ask is that you please make use of the chat function to log any questions you might have for the 4 of us. Just for those of you that are new to Zoom, oh, hang on, that isn't any of you, because we're now 2.5 years post-COVID. You should all be familiar with these kinds of platforms. But if you are new to Zoom, in your control panel at the bottom of the screen, you've got a chat icon that'll bring up your chat box. And in there, you can go and type messages to your heart's content. We will monitor the chats as they come through. And obviously, where we're able to, we'll respond to those as much as we can during the presentation. But if we're limited in terms of our ability to respond to those questions coming through in the chat function, we will go through them afterwards. And if there are any of those questions we've not been able to respond to, we will see who the question has come from, and we will then respond by email to the questions that you ask. So yeah, in terms of the 4 hours, that's quite a long time to keep you engaged. We're going to try and make it not so much entertaining, that would be nice, but certainly informative. But we will schedule 2 breaks during the 4-hour session, just to give you an opportunity to go off and get that much needed caffeine injection, I imagine. So you can look forward to 2 15-minute breathers during the course of the 4 hours. Okay, that's the admin done and dusted. So in terms of working through the content, we're going to basically drive the presentation through the slideshow. You have been sent the PDF document for the slides, so you're welcome to follow along there if you would like to. There are also a couple of additional attachments that were sent through to you. Those are mostly relevant to what I'm going to be discussing with you. So where necessary, I'll share those on the screen with you as I talk through the various elements that are necessary. And we're going to do at least 1 poll, and we're going to do that quite shortly, just to get feedback from you about certain questions in terms of where you are with CA 2025 in relation to your understanding of various elements that we're going to then be discussing. Okay, so let's get stuck into the detail. I think just from a high-level point of view, the objectives of this morning's session. This is always pitched at 2 levels. So it's both to do with an assessment refresher. So this is typically in reference to information you should already have and be relatively familiar with. And this is an opportunity just to remind you of a couple of key points around the understanding of these matters. And then the second component would be in reference to an update. So just bringing you up to speed. In terms of the various subcategories here, from a refresher point of view, we're going to just remind you of assessment and the importance of assessment and where it fits into the bigger picture, both in a local and international context. We'll then go through and just do a kind of a high-level overview of the key differences between 2016 and 2025 from a training program point of view, but from a more practical perspective. You know, no doubt you've all been through various different training interventions so far around CA 2025, and you may have been taken through a sort of a comparison between the old competency framework and the new competency framework. So you know there are more digital acumen in the new training program. You know there's this concept of integrated thinking. You know it's much more forward thinking than historical. Those things are kind of done and dusted. But let's look at the practical application of CA 2025 and what that means in comparison to the older training program. We'll then go and have a look at the use of the assessment instruments. So just the role of this Lord of the Rings document. No, I can't get that out of my head. The LOR, the Learning Outcomes Review document. What is the role of the LOR, particularly in terms of the gathering of evidence to then feed through into the PDS, the Professional Development Summary. And again, I imagine by now you're starting to get familiar with all these new little acronyms. So we've got LORs and PDSs and EATs. And I think the more time we spend with these, the more familiar we'll become with them. As Nao mentioned, this is the start of a new journey for a lot of us, myself included. And there's some pretty fundamental shifts in thinking with CA 2025 that I think is going to take a little bit of time to get our heads around. And I think sessions like this, the more we can do this kind of intervention, the closer we get to the optimum understanding of the training program and how to use it in the most effective, efficient manner. We'll then go in and spend a little bit of time looking at the quality requirements for the evidence that needs to be submitted by trainees. Not that dissimilar to what we had in the old training program, but SAICA has been a little bit more prescriptive in terms of what they require from trainees when documenting evidence. And Sandra is going to take us through that conversation. Then I will take you through just a very high level, a reminder of formative and summative assessment, these two different stages of assessment, not dissimilar to the old training program, but just what does this mean in the context of CA 2025? I will then take you through a couple of the more challenging PVAs, professional values and attitudes and enabling acumen. No doubt in you putting together your training plans and starting to think about, examples of how trainees might display these things. There are a couple of them that are a bit more tricky than others. I mean, there are a lot of them that are pretty straightforward and pretty obvious, but I'm going to go and highlight, certainly in terms of what I've seen over the last 6 months, some of the PVAs that not only trainees, but other role players are more challenged by. What do these things mean? What do they actually require from trainees in terms of the submission of evidence? So I'll work through some of those with you. And then lastly, from a refresher point of view, I'm going to spend a bit more time with you on these new proficiency matrices. We've got 3 decision trees now in comparison to the old 2. One of them is applied at an LOR level, 2 decision trees at a PDS level, which is different to what we had before. But particularly the LOR decision tree around the acumen, these 4 dimensions, this issue of guidance and task completion and task understanding and dependencies, those are quite confusing, to be quite honest. And I do think they merit further exploration. And we're going to spend a little bit of time going back through those 4 dimensions, just going and making sure that you have a clear understanding of what those dimensions are actually looking to measure. Then from an update perspective, we're going to then hand over to Nao, who will give you an update in terms of the status of implementation of CA 2025. Where are we? How many training officers have been onboarded? The original intended deadline of 30 June has been extended to the 31st of August for those firms that weren't able to implement by the 30th of June. So Nao will just give us an update in terms of where we sit in that process. Then Nao will also give, and I'm sure this you're going to be looking forward to, what is the impact of CA 2025 on training office reviews? Many of you might have upcoming training office reviews that have been scheduled into the second half of the year. CA 2025, obviously brand new, and you might have some concerns about, what are SAICA going to be looking for? How lenient are SAICA going to be? How flexible are they going to be? And Nao will give you some insight into the thinking around the upcoming reviews in the context of CA 2025. And then lastly, we will hand over to Lunga just to take us through a couple of the EAT implementation considerations. Just some things that in his experience he's been finding are more challenging, and he can give us some guidance in terms of how to respond to those issues to make sure that when you do go and run CA 2025, things are smooth with the onboarding process. Okay, so quite a lot to get through, and you can perhaps start to appreciate the need for 4 hours of your time. Okay, so before we get stuck into the detailed content, I'm going to ask you to do a quick self-reflection. And those of you familiar with CA 2025 understand this need for self-reflection. Trainees do it all the time. Reviewers give feedback to trainees on development areas they need to work on. The whole PDS process is a self-reflection by trainees, which is then discussed with evaluators and corroborated by assessors. Even in your CPD process, it's a self-reflection. So just in the context of what we're going to be discussing this morning, I'm going to ask you to complete a quick poll, and I'll launch the poll shortly and it'll pop up on your screen. And there are 3 questions I want you to consider here, and obviously be honest in your consideration. Just also note your considerations and your votings in the poll are anonymous, but I will share the results of the poll with everyone. So we'll get a chance to see where everyone sits as a group in terms of these 3 areas. So the 3 areas that I'm going to ask you to do a reflection on will firstly be your level of comfort / understanding of CA 2025 in general. How familiar are you with it? How comfortable are you with it? Then the requirements around the evidence submission for the PVAAs in the LORs. How comfortable are you with those requirements? Do you understand what SAICA require from your trainees when they're recording evidence in the LOR? And then thirdly, these proficiency ratings, the proficiency matrices and the related decision trees that attach to those. How comfortable are you with those? Do you feel comfortable that you're able to use them? Are you familiar with the decision tree? Do you understand the different questions that are asked in the decision tree? Okay, so let's get that poll going. I'm going to launch it now. There'll be a pop-up window appearing on your screen shortly. You can click and drag this thing around. You can resize it. You'll see a slider bar on the right-hand side where you can click and drag down to get to all questions. And let me give you, it won't take long, perhaps 30 to 40 seconds just to go through and respond to these 3 poll questions. Okay, over to you for the next short while. People, we're looking good with the poll. We've got almost 3/4 of you having voted here. So just a final 10 seconds to get your votes in before I then close the poll and share the results with you. All right. Good people, let me then end the poll and let's have a look at where you sit as a group in terms of these 3 questions. Okay, so if I show you the results of the poll, you'll see that on your screen now. In terms of the current level of understanding, 5 gurus in the room, that's good. I hope it isn't the 4 of us as facilitators plus 1 other. I hope it's more than that. But just in terms of that percentage thing there, the majority group, almost 50% of you have an okay understanding. But again, a third of you saying know very little about CA 2025. So clearly that reflection might lead to some development plans being required from your side to go and get more understanding. Certainly during the course of the morning, it's our intention to give you a bit more information about CA 2025. And Nao, a little bit later on, will just remind you of some of the resources that SAICA have made available to upskill yourselves in understanding CA 2025. In terms of the second question and your understanding of the quality of evidence requirements, Again, encouraging to see, 30%, a third of you with a good understanding. But again, 60% almost that are not sure you have the correct understanding, and 10% what's an LOR. Okay, so clearly they're needing to get the upskilling in terms of CA 2025 going. We will talk to what an LOR is, but I think more importantly, we will talk to the evidence requirements in these LORs a little bit later on this morning. In terms of those proficiency matrices, again, fairly small group that are completely comfortable, but encouraging to see almost 60% being reasonably comfortable. But again, we've got almost 40% who are not at all familiar with these proficiency matrices. So I will take you through those proficiency matrices a little bit later on. But, once again, and I think this will support what Neo is going to take you through a little bit later, there really are a number of resources available to people to go along and become more familiar with these. There are various guidance documents, there are training sessions, and Neo will remind you of that a bit later. So I do think you have the ability to go and get the understanding. Obviously, it's a question of allocating the time and then going off and doing that. Okay, so thank you for that. It certainly gives us as a group of facilitators, I think, a fairly good understanding of where you sit from a knowledge and application perspective. So what I'm then going to do is hand over to Neo, who's going to just remind you of this, where assessment fits into this whole process and why this assessment process is so important. Okay, Neo, over to you.
Thanks, Graham. So just to take you through in terms of the importance of assessment, I'll just start within our local context regarding SAICA in terms of the SAICA requirement for the designations we have. So I think or if not all of us on the call, we might be familiar in terms of the designations we have as SAICA. So we've got the CA designation, which would be the well-established brand that we have in terms of SAICA. Then we also have the AGA designation that we recently, I think in some recent years we had that going. Then we also have the AT designation, the accounting technicians. So in terms of the CA designation, that's got a level 7 in terms of SAICA. So what we're currently doing, or what's been planned as SAICA, is that we want to look at possibly a re-registration in terms of the CA designation, having a higher designation, at least sitting at a level 8 or even higher. That will still go through. Then we also have the AT designation that's already registered with SAICA as a level 5. And we're also in the process of registering the AGA with SAICA. So that's in terms of the local context. Then I just wanted to just share in terms of the international context now. Then this is now where we look at IFAC now. Us being a member body of IFAC in terms of the requirements that we have with IFAC. So also on my side, I think coming on this side, I had to just go through, I think Graham has assisted me in terms of reaching even to some of the assessor material that I used to go through, is that what are these requirements? So I looked at in terms of what they have in terms of the Accounting Education Standards Board. So that would be the base that you'd look through. And then there you'd get that there's the international education standards that we have from that context. Then just for our context, I think what's quite important is looking at the initial professional development. So there's IES 2 up till IES 6 that looks at the initial professional development. But I just want to look at in terms of IES 6 in the initial professional development when we're looking at the assessment of professional competence. So in terms of that, in terms of the requirements that we have there, there's the formal assessment of professional competence. Then there's also the principles of assessment, which is quite key for today, whereby as an IFAC member bodies, they should design assessment activities that are high levels of reliability, validity, equity, transparency, and sufficiency within the accounting education programs. And also what's required also as the last requirement is that there should be verifiable evidence. So as a IFAC member, we shall base the assessment on professional competence of the aspiring professional accountant. So that's just the importance in terms of the international context as an IFAC member. And it's quite exciting to see as SAICA, we actually, in some of these requirements, quite at the forefront of all of these matters. And then also, which is quite key in terms of the assessment, process, it's the quality control measures. And I think as all the various role players that we're sitting today, I think it's quite important understanding each and every one of us's role in terms of the assessment, ensuring that the entry level into the profession, they are at the proficiency level that we would require. And then lastly, that what I just wanted to touch on, I think, and also looking at the journey that we've taken with CA25, it's in terms of the role of lifelong learning for all the role players. As CA25 is new, and we also talk about the EAT, it's a change management system whereby, you know, there's a lot of change that's coming in. So even from my side, I've also had to embrace and then look at, in terms of self-development, what do I need to look at that I'm also preparing myself for this journey that we're taking and for this CA25, in terms of, we want this to be relevant in terms of our profession and what are the matters that would make us specifically relevant for that. And also the other requirement when you referring to this lifelong learning is also the adaptive mindset and the agility. And as we also have matters that we look at and challenges that we come across, I think it's quite important that we continuously develop ourselves to understand what we do not necessarily know. So I think development is quite key, and yeah, lifelong learning is very important. I think whether you're a reviewer, whether you are going to be an evaluator, or whether you are the assessor and being the ultimate in terms of being the actual training officer within this process. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks very much, Neo. Yeah, and I think that last point you've just spoken to, when we look at the results of the poll, clearly there are a couple of you that that do have some lifelong learning to take place in terms of CA 2025 and becoming a little bit more familiar with it. Okay, so thanks, Neo, for that. Let me then hand over to Sandra, who's going to take you through some of the key practical differences between CA 2025 and 2016.
Thank you, Graham. Appreciate that. Okay, so I think it's important for us to start off with just recognizing that with CA 2025, we've got our 3 competency types, being the enabling competencies or acumens that we refer to, the PVAs, and your technical competency types. So when we're talking acronyms, the professional values and attitudes are the PVAs. And then the acumens are what makes that acronym that you see in the second bullet point, the PVAAs. And that's what we're going to be focusing on assessing in the training programs in CA 2025. And so what we are not assessing in CA 2025 is the technical competencies. And that's the big shift when Neo was talking about that adaptive mindset and the agility. I think that's what a lot of people grapple with in the beginning when looking at CA 2025, is that shift in no longer assessing the technical competencies. So you'll see on that first point in 2016, trainees used the work they were doing on the job to demonstrate competence in prescribed technical tasks. And we also had our professional skills, the PC values that the trainees needed to demonstrate, but the technical was very prescriptive. CA 2025, we're saying we need the technical context. The technical work must still be there. It's just not going to be assessed in the training program. Now, I think it's important in part of that adaptive mindset and agility to note, we're not saying you're not going to review the technical work. We're not saying you're not going to give your trainees feedback on how they're performing the technical work. That's fundamentally important. It's just not going to be part of what we are assessing. We're tracking it, and we'll speak through this in the slides that we go through a little bit later on, but we are going to track that technical exposure. The assessment, however, will be of your professional values, attitudes, and acumens. All right, so I think the other key thing to note is that the actual work you're giving your trainees to do, the work that they're performing on a day-to-day basis, will largely remain the same. So what you are allocating to your trainees to do shouldn't change much. There will be some change that needs to happen depending on how it plays out in the practical application of the acumens, but largely it will be remaining the same. All right, so if we look at, I just want to make sure I'm covering everything on the slide. 2016 trainees used their work to demonstrate competence in prescribed technical tasks. With 2025, the technical work becomes a context within which trainees are demonstrating the PVAAs. We're not going to assess the technical competence. Exposure to technical learning outcomes is, however, recorded and monitored in the assessment documents. And when we talk about a trainee needing to demonstrate PVAAs in a technical context, we're talking about within a professional assignment, within a professional context environment that we're wanting them to demonstrate the professional values, attitudes, and acumens. All right. Graham, I think if you can flip to the next slide for me. The next important point to note is that our PDS cycles are allowing a bit more flexibility in CA 2025. So in the 2016 framework, the requirement was that we must have, okay, sorry, let me just step back. PDS is a professional development summary. And that's going to be, you can equate it somewhat to the ANA document, your assessment need analysis. All right. So under the 2016 framework, your ANAs, you were required to complete every 6 months. So you were meeting with your trainees on a 6-monthly basis to discuss progress. There was the option to meet more regularly, and there were some training officers that would meet every 4 months, especially in commerce and industry. Right, but most training officers were sitting on the 6-month cycles. With 2025, there are now options also for 3, 4, and 6-month PDS cycles. So we really are encouraging you to think about what works for your training office in terms of meeting with your trainees, discussing progress. And if you feel that 3 or 4 monthly meetings would be more beneficial, then you have that option available to you. So that would be your PDS cycles where you've got more flexibility being made available. Okay. Then we need to talk about our proficiency ratings. Now, I'm going to start introducing this, Graham. We'll cover it in more detail later on. Just give me a moment here. I just want to quickly get my screen back. Graham will talk about it in a little bit more detail later on when he looks at the decision trees. But we, in the 2016 framework, had a rating scale of 1 to 4 that we used to measure competence. So we had our very set list of technical tasks, and we had our PC values, which we didn't rate, and we had our other professional skills that we rated. We had the different decision trees that we were using to rate the technical and the professional skills, but we were using that same rating scale of 1 to 4 to measure the degree of competence and really how the trainee was moving from not competent to exit level competence, right? With CA 2025, we're talking about proficiency and proficiency ratings. And what we are looking at with the proficiency ratings is the context of proficiency. the technical work we've said now is going to be the context within which the trainees are demonstrating the professional values, attitudes and acumens, and we're needing to look at this context of the proficiency that the trainees have displayed the acumen within. Right. So again, let's just step back a little bit. 2016 framework, definite technical, and your pervasive skills made up of PC values and other professional skills. Right. Technical, the work the trainees were doing on the job was prescriptive, and we were rating the prescriptive technical tasks based on what was happening on the job. There was no real need to present more evidence in the assessment documents because we had it in the working papers, if I can call it that. Okay. When we talk about our other professional skills and pervasive skills in the 2016 framework, we needed evidence of that to be presented in the assessment documents in the PSR by trainees. And they needed to give us evidence that allowed us to see how they were demonstrating their professional skills and how they were demonstrating competence in those professional skills. So they, in 2016 framework in the PSR, presenting a narrative to us that we've got certain requirements from a quality perspective, which we will talk about a little bit later on again. But there's a narrative in terms of the quality requirements for the PSR evidence for the 2016 framework. Right. When we look at CA 2025 and we look at the fact that we are now giving our trainees technical work to do, but assessing the professional values and attitudes and acumens, they needing to bring that evidence to us in the assessment documents in a similar way to which they brought the evidence in the PSR documents. Right. So we have our trainees presenting us with a piece of evidence that tells us how they believe they have displayed the behavior or used the acumen in this professional context while doing the technical work. Right. So we're going to have this narrative. The fact that they are presenting evidence to us and that the reviewer is getting to a point where they are able to rate the evidence means that the trainee has displayed the behavior. They have used the acumen. Okay. Otherwise, we wouldn't have them presenting the evidence to us, or we wouldn't have the reviewer being willing to rate it. So what's happening then is when the reviewer is rating that piece of evidence, they are giving us a measure. Their proficiency rating is giving us a measure of the context of the proficiency, the context of the situation that the trainee demonstrated that behavior or used that acumen within. And when we look at our proficiency ratings, we're moving from basic to intermediate to advanced. And our trainees are needing to achieve basic being a proficiency level of 1, intermediate being a proficiency level of 2, and advanced being a proficiency level of 3. They needing to achieve those proficiency levels for the professional values, attitudes, and acumens, but they're not necessarily all at level 3. So there's some, and it's a very small number, but there are some of your PVAAs where they'll be needing to achieve a proficiency level of 1, small number of it 2, majority are at level 3. All right. And we're wanting to see how our trainees are demonstrating the actual acumen in the evidence they're bringing us, and then we measure the context of proficiency through the rating that we are providing. Right. So I think the key thing to note when we are looking at practical differences with CA 2025 is the nature of the evidence that we're going to be looking at and the actual quantity of the learning outcomes that connects not connects, but that we are needing to assess in the LOR, Learner Outcome Review documents. Okay, so 2016 framework, if we look at how many tasks we had to consider, we had the 6 PC values, we had the 24 other professional skills, and then depending on your electives, you had around 70 prescribed technical tasks that needed to be covered, right? So that's about 100 tasks that you were looking at over the term of the training contract to get your trainee competent. Okay, again, we give them the technical work to do. They go and do it. They gather the technical evidence. While they're doing that, they demonstrate the professional skills and PC values. They bring us the detail of how they demonstrated those skills. We rate it, we assess it, we get them hopefully to a point of competence, and we sign off the training contract. Okay. If you look at those numbers, the majority of that evidence was coming through in the technical tasks. And again, I go back to what I said earlier, that's happening on the job, right? The evidence is in a working paper, right? Much fewer numbers of tasks needed to be presented in this detailed narrative that the trainee is giving you in the PSR document, right? CA 2025, we are looking at 21 PVAs, professional values and attitudes, learning outcomes. And we're looking at 74 acumen, right? So in total, we're actually sitting with fewer learning outcomes. We're sitting with 95 learning outcomes that need to be assessed, right? But what we are assessing has shifted. So our trainees, firstly, are going to be spending more time documenting evidence in the assessment documents. Okay. They're also needing to ensure that what they are documenting as evidence is meeting SAICA's requirements, the quality requirements. So that's going to take quite a bit more time for trainees to actually document the evidence. And then what's important is for your reviewers in the learning outcome reviews, your learners are needing, or your trainees are, your reviewers in the learner outcome reviews are needing to actually work through that evidence. Where it's not meeting quality requirements, send it back to the trainee, get them to fix that evidence, and then work through a process of rating that evidence. Okay, so the time it takes for trainees and reviewers to work through the evidence in CA 2025, at least initially, and when I say initially, in the beginning of any training contract for trainees and in implementing CA 2025 or for new reviewers, the amount of time it's going to take to complete the assessment documents is going to be increased initially. And I'm hoping then over time, as trainees get used to documenting evidence and doing it properly, and as reviewers get used to the process, that time will reduce. Right, so when we look at the minimum requirements for evidence, we are speaking about in 2016 framework, SAICA had the requirement of at least evidence being presented every 2 months in the TSR and PSR, right? Now, again, we've got to step back. The original idea with the PSR was that trainees were presenting evidence real time, okay? The idea was as the trainee presents or demonstrates the professional skill or the PC value, they document it. So even though with the PSR, we had the option of presenting evidence every 2 months, or the requirement of presenting evidence every 2 months, ideally our trainees should have been presenting that PSR on a more regular basis, monthly, every couple of weeks, right? But at least every 2 months. And we said we needed at least 1 PC value and 1 other professional skill every 2 months, right? CA 2025, the minimum requirement from SAICA's side is every month. Okay, so we need to see a learner outcome review at least on a monthly basis. Now, again, if we think about the nature of the evidence that we are needing to present in the LOR, we need to encourage our trainees to document that evidence more regularly. Weekly, ideally, for trainees to document evidence weekly will be great. Okay, that's going to mean that the trainee is able to give you more accurate evidence, more detailed evidence. It's going to make the job of the reviewer actually working through that evidence and discussing it with the trainee easier. So the whole process will then go faster if the trainees are documenting evidence more regularly, but at least every month. Okay. Then we need to see at least one example of the 95 PVAAs every month. Okay. And the key thing is actually when you look at your PDS cycles to ensure that we're covering one example from each competency area in every PDS cycle. Okay. So the PDS cycle, PDS is like your ANA cycles. You're going to decide for your training office if that's going to be every 3, 4, or 6 months. Okay. Then you've got to, when you're looking at minimum requirements, step back and say, for a PDS cycle, if I look at the evidence my trainee has submitted, have I at least got one piece of evidence from each of the competency areas? Okay. Now, when we're talking about competency areas, we've got professional values and attitudes as a competency type that we're looking at in the assessment process for the training program. And we've got your acumens as a competency type. Within the professional values and attitudes, there are 3 competency areas, right? So that's your ethics, citizenship, and lifelong learning. And then within your acumens, you've got 4 competency areas, and that is your business acumen, decision-making, your relational, and your digital acumen, right? So all in all, 7 competency areas in the PVAAs, and you are needing to submit evidence, or trainee must make sure that they submit evidence for at least one example from each of those competency areas for every PDS cycle. Now, I want to say that that is bare minimum, right? If that's all that your trainees are doing, you're going to struggle to get them signed off. They are going to have to do a lot more than that. All right. So you're going to have to internally decide for your training office what requirements you want to put in place for your trainees to make sure that you have sufficient evidence to determine final sign-off at the end of the training contract. Okay. Good. Graham, I'm seeing chats happening in the background. I don't know if there are any questions that I need to answer yet. I'm guessing that you are looking after them for me.
I think we're fine, Sandra. I'm responding to them as much as I can as we go along. And if there are any that I've not been able to, I'll raise them. We can raise them towards the end of the session. Okay,
perfect. All right. So I'm sorry, I'm just noting Andrew's comments about one technical learning outcome in every LOR. So yes, we will, I'll talk to technical learning outcomes shortly. Okay. All right, so when we look at the creation of evidence, I've started chatting about this a little bit already, but in 2016, as I've said, we had our TSRs and our PSRs typically being created at the end of every 2 months or every assignment. Okay, now, that doesn't necessarily mean that was the right way to do things. That's typically what happened. Ideally, what we should be doing in 2016, as well as 2025, is we should be sitting down with our trainees before each assignment and discussing what they will be doing. Discussing, and I'm talking 2016 now specifically, discussing the technical work that they'll be doing, the technical tasks they're going to be rating, and the professional skills that they're going to need to demonstrate to get that technical work done, right? So your trainee can, in the 2016 framework, already open up the documents and start planning what's going to happen in that assignment, what's going to happen in those 2 months. And they can, as they're doing the work, start documenting the evidence, right? But in order to rate the evidence in the 2016 framework, the trainees had to get the work done. So we couldn't finish off that document until the assignment was done, because we needed to see how they responded to review queries. We needed to wrap up the assignment. And so typically the document was finalized, well, created and finalized at the end of every 2 months, but it at least had to be finished at the end of the assignment. We couldn't do it earlier. Right. In 2025, that same thinking of planning needs to happen, right? So trainee needs to sit down with the line manager reviewer at the beginning of an assignment, at the beginning of the job, and say, what are we doing here? What technical work am I going to be doing in the next month, let's say? They need to think about learning outcomes that technical work connects to. Now, I haven't really spoken about the technical learning outcomes yet, right? I've spoken about the fact that the trainees will be doing technical work, but there are actually technical learning outcomes that we connecting that work to, right? To track the technical exposure, to track the context within which the trainees are demonstrating the PVAAs. So my trainee is going to sit down with the line manager, discuss the work that they're going to be doing, technical work, link it to the technical learning outcomes. And then they're going to start thinking about what professional values and attitudes they're going to need to demonstrate while doing this technical work. So it should be sounding quite similar to 2016 framework, except that they can straight away start documenting evidence for how they demonstrated those PVAAs, or how they are intending to demonstrate those PVAAs. As they demonstrate the PVAA, they can document the evidence. They don't have to wait until the technical work has been wrapped up, because they, in a moment in time, will demonstrate a PVA or an acumen while doing that technical work, and they can then document what they did as evidence and present it to the reviewer, and the reviewer can give them feedback. Right, and they can actually then probably, for the same piece of technical work, be documenting, and technical work now could be quite small or quite big, the assignment that we're referring to, but they could typically be documenting different pieces of evidence for the same acumen while working on an assignment, and growing and developing in that demonstration of that actual acumen. So we're not needing to wait to the end of the assignment or the 2 months. The trainees are actively able to present evidence as they're going along. And that creates such a wonderful opportunity for us to develop our trainees and for them to learn. And that is where our reviewers need to step in and start sharing with the trainees what these PVAs and acumens mean. What are we wanting from a trainee? Giving them the direction and guidance initially, and then letting the trainee move into a space where they can start initiating the demonstration of those acumens without anybody prompting them, and then eventually moving to the levels of proficiency where we can sign them off. And now I'm going back to what Nayo said earlier, where we need to look at our own lifelong learning, right? So our reviewers, evaluators, assessors, whatever your role is within the training program, we need to go through those lists of learning outcomes for the professional values, attitudes, and acumens, and consider how we are demonstrating them and where we may need to go and upskill ourselves a little so that we are equipped to develop our trainees. Okay, so please take advantage of the opportunity to get your teeth stuck into the PVAAs from a personal, professional competence perspective, and that will then equip you in developing your trainees and helping them through this process of demonstrating the acumen and documenting the evidence. All right, so just making sure I've covered everything on the slide. think I'm happy that everything is being covered there. Yeah, that's good. All right. So when we talk about recording of this evidence, we are speaking about it happening on a new assessment tool that SAICA has developed and is making available to training officers. And that assessment tool is called the EAT, the Electronic Assessment Tool. All right. So in the past, you had various options of how you went about recording your evidence. If you were using a service provider and an online assessment tool, or you were deciding to use manual documents, that was really training office specific. Now everyone has to use SAICA's electronic assessment tool, and that's where Lunga will be chatting a little bit later about the assessment tool and getting everybody onto the assessment tool and starting to use it. All right. So obviously for 2016, you'll continue with whichever system you were using, but going forward for CA 2025, we must be using the electronic assessment tool. Good. Thank you. Okay, so Graham's flicking through the slides for me. What we are looking at when we are sort of chatting through the big picture of the assessment documents, and Graham will go into more detail, obviously looking at formative assessments and also when looking at the rating of evidence. But just the big picture on the job, what's happening is we are giving our trainees work to do, okay? And it's important that we are thinking about the work we're giving our trainees to do and the complexity of the work we're giving the trainees to do and what acumens and PVAs they are able to demonstrate in doing that work. So we've got to properly plan the work that we're giving to our trainees. All right. That's going to create the exposure. Right, so the technical work requires them to be exposed to and utilize various technical learning outcomes, which we are going to identify. Again, at the beginning of the job, we'll identify what technical learning outcomes we think will be demonstrated. And as they're going along, they might find some are no longer relevant, some new ones kick in. So at the point of actually completing the LRR, they'll look at what technical learning outcomes they used demonstrated and are presenting evidence for, right? And this is going to then provide the context within which they displayed the behaviors and the acumens. So giving us this picture of the context. But we're not asking them to document anything around the proficiency for the technical learning outcomes. Okay, so not assessing the technical learning outcomes, but tell me about what technical work you were doing. Right. Once I've got the context, we're then going to go and look at what behaviors, professional values and attitudes and acumens were demonstrated while doing the technical work, right? So they're going to then describe in detail the actual behaviors and acumens that they demonstrated. So there's a list, the list of 95 learning outcomes for our PVAAs. They'll go and identify which particular ones they are wanting to present evidence for, and then they will describe to us in detail how they demonstrated that behavior or acumen, right? And then what will happen in the learner outcome review, this is all in the learner outcome review, the trainee for the acumens will rate themselves and rate their proficiency or the context, the proficiency in the context of the technical work they were doing. Okay, now you must please note we're talking about rating proficiency in the acumen. The trainees are not going to be rating proficiency in the professional values and attitudes in the learner outcome review. And I think Graham will go into a little bit more detail around that when he speaks through the decision trees. Okay, so the trainees are going to be submitting this evidence to the reviewer. Right, this is a technical work. These are the learning outcomes they connect to. These are the actual professional values, attitudes, and acumens that I demonstrated. This is a detail around how I demonstrated the acumen. And this is the acumens and the PVAs. And this is my consideration of the proficiency that I believe the acumen was demonstrated at. Right. The reviewer needs to work through all of that and consider, firstly, do I agree? Do I agree with this evidence? Okay, do I agree with this piece of technical work my trainee said they did? When I read through the evidence, did I see this happening? Is it true? Is it sufficiently detailed? Once they are comfortable with the evidence the trainees presented, they've corroborated that evidence, they are then able to themselves, for the acumens, go and rate the evidence. Okay, so that's going to be gathering of evidence of what happened on the job. And the role players here are going to be the trainee and the reviewer, the line manager, who's on the job with the trainee. Now, again, keep in mind that line manager is reviewing the work from a technical perspective on the job. Okay, so they've been involved. They know, they've seen the trainee doing this. So when I spoke earlier about it taking more time for the reviewer, it's simply because of the nature of the documented evidence that they're needing to work through that's going to increase the time. There shouldn't really be much more that they need to go and look into. In other words, they're not going to have to go and look on the working papers or ask more questions, because ideally your reviewer should be on the job with the trainee. Right, they know what happened, they saw what happened, they just need to make sure that what the trainees documented is true and meets the quality requirements. Okay, good. Then what happens is with your PDS, your professional development summary, all the evidence that we have gathered on the job pulls into the PDS document. Okay. So what's going to happen in the PDS is that my trainees are going to sit down with the evaluators. They're going to meet and discuss their progress. Where are we at? Are we collecting enough evidence? How are we progressing? Are we meeting expectations? What do we need to tweak going forward? All right. So your PDS, the evidence submitted during each PDS cycle is accumulated. And we're going to use this evidence to determine current levels of demonstrated proficiency. And we're then going to, once we've determined current levels of demonstrated proficiency, going to compare that to what we're expecting at this point in time, right? So when you are putting together all your documents for CA 2025, one of the requirements is that you put together your expected levels of proficiency that is actually going to be uploaded into the electronic assessment tool. And you're going to use that to compare your current levels to the expected levels, and that will obviously identify development needs. Okay. The other thing that's going to happen in your PDS is you're going to consider the technical exposure. You're going to consider the technical outcomes that your trainee has actually connected the technical work to that they've done on the job. And that document we talk about as the integrated exposure plan. What did I plan for my trainee? I'm going to compare what actually happened to the plan. Okay, that's important because we need to ensure that the context within which our trainees are demonstrating the PVAAs allows them to get to advanced proficiency levels. Right, so the technical context must be right. And our PDS is requiring us to consider whether we need to shift that exposure in any way to allow for the technical outcomes to feed into the proper demonstration and proficiency of the PVAAs. Okay, so the next point, PVAs and acumen identified where their demonstrated proficiency is behind expectations. And then, as I've said now, sorry, I jumped ahead a bit on this one. Development plans are agreed on to enable trainees to get back on track. Right, so very similar concept to what we had with development needs in the ANA document. Where are you? Where should you be? How do I fix this to ensure that I can sign you off at the end date of the training contract? All right. And then what happens is our assessors step into the process. So up to this point, it's the trainee and the evaluator role, meeting, discussing where we're at, where should we be, how do we plan to fix this? Now my assessor steps in and they need to corroborate the evaluator's decisions. So obviously this requires the assessor to do the relevant work, ensure there's sufficient evidence, everything's been adequately documented, but they're going to go through a process of determining whether the trainee there's sufficient evidence to support the decisions around the summative proficiency levels to support ultimately the final sign-off of the trainee. So you can see the same role players are going to be involved in the assessment process. The concepts and principles remain the same. It's just the actual tools that we're using, the documents that we're referring to, and what the actual learning outcomes that we're assessing that is shifting. Good. Graham, I did note that you said we're going to have a break after this slide.
Thanks, Sandra. Yes, I think so. We've been going for an hour and a bit. My general rule with these kind of presentations is every hour to hour and a half, we take a break. So we're almost at an hour and 10 minutes. I think it's a good time to go and send you off to go and get a caffeine injection and maybe check in on those work emails. So people, it's 9:35. I'm going to ask if we could please resume at 9:50. That will give you just under 15 minutes. So I'm going to just type that into the chat box. And I'll also change the slide just to remind you of that. You don't need to leave the session. You can stay dialed in, but go off, take a comfort break, and we will see you back in. And Sandra will get straight into looking at the quality of evidence when we return. Enjoy the first break. All right, good people, welcome back in after that first comfort break. So let me then hand back over to Sandra to take you through the requirements for quality of evidence, which is going to be another 20 minutes or so. So let's hand over, and Sandra, go for it.
Thanks for that, Graham. All right. I hope you all had a good tea break. I didn't manage to get through my cup of coffee, but I have it here in front of me, keeping my hands warm. So we're good to go. Okay, so we've now spoken about the fact that we are assessing the professional values and attitudes and acumens. The trainees are needing to explain to us the technical work that they did, the context that they were in when they demonstrated the professional value, attitude, or acumen. And they need to give us the detail, the narrative around how they demonstrated the behavior or the acumen. All right. So with the PSR, we used to have the requirements, the wording changed over time, but let's essentially say the positive, specific, verifiable evidence. That was a 2016 requirement for the PSR. Similar principles with the evidence for the PVAAs in CA 2025, but more. And I want to say, but better. Okay. There is much work to be done in most training offices with the quality of evidence that trainees provide in these narrative formats. And that's going to need lots of attention. And again, that shouldn't really be a shift from 2016 to CA 2025. But I do think practically it is going to be a shift for many training offices. So something to just be aware of when we are looking at adaptability and agility, being able to actually start doing this right. Okay, so we're speaking about the evidence needing to be specific, it must be detailed, and it must demonstrate an understanding of the particular professional value, attitude, or acumen that the trainee is presenting evidence for. So really what this comes down to for me is real-time evidence. And we spoke about this earlier when we looked at the minimum requirements for how often our trainees must present evidence. I want my trainees to be submitting evidence as they demonstrate, or at least documenting evidence. Let me rather say that. I want trainees to be documenting evidence as they are demonstrating that PVA or acumen. Okay, and as far as they can, to bring it down to a moment, to a point in time, to an event that they are now telling us the story about. Okay, and if they can start getting that real-time documentation of evidence happening, we will get more specific and more detailed evidence. Right. When we talk about the demonstration of understanding, I use the word that the action is appropriate in the situation. And for a trainee to determine if the action is appropriate requires them to actually understand the scenario, to understand the complexities of the scenarios that they find themselves within, and also to understand what that acumen is actually about. Where do they get that understanding? From the line managers and the reviewers and academic knowledge and their own lifelong learning, their own research, right? So we've got to go through a process of training in our training programs, teaching, talking to our trainees about what the demonstration of this PVAA means. And we've got a start for CA 2025 in the guidance documents that have been provided to us. And we need to continue adding to our examples collectively and in our individual contexts, in our own training offices. We need to start putting together this idea, this communication to trainees about what we are meaning when we're talking about the different PVAAs, and also what we're expecting from them, and then teaching them that. Okay, and that will help them to be able to explain to us why in this situation, this demonstration of the PVAA was appropriate. Okay, and then once they've given us all that detail, the reviewer must verify it and corroborate the evidence. Okay, now please make sure if you are a reviewer or if you are relying on reviewers, that you are being very focused on the fact that your reviewers do not accept evidence that is not meeting SAICA's requirements. Okay, so there's a need to push back, and the system really does allow, the new electronic assessment tool facilitates that pushback to trainees to say to them, you're not giving me enough here. You've left out a good chunk of what actually happened in the scenario. You need to provide more detail or more specific information for me. And if you are reading the evidence and you're finding it's very generic, you don't quite understand what happened, or you've still got questions, then it means the trainee needs to give you more, right? It must be very clear from the evidence that the trainee gets what this PVAA is about. I recently read something that said we assess what I can assess what you show, not what you know. And the narrative that the trainee is giving us is them showing us something that we can actually assess. And if they're not showing the reviewer, we can't take it further. All right, good. Thank you, Graham. So what we speak about is the journalistic questions. Now, again, please take what we're discussing here and also apply it to PSR evidence for the 2016 framework, right? But focusing on CA 2025, the detail happens with real-time documentation and with our trainees considering the typical journalistic questions, right? So what, who, what, where, when, why, and how. Once my trainees documented how they've demonstrated, what they did to demonstrate the PVAA, they can then go through these questions and check that they have actually answered each of these questions. And it's really just a practical checklist that they can use to provide as much evidence as possible to provide that detail. When we look at the where, for example, I mean, that can change. It could be I was in the office, I was at the client, It could be, the where could be, was it online? Was it face-to-face? It could be a particular rotation that the trainee was in. So what we speak about as the where will differ based on the situation, but for my trainee to think about the where did I get this information? Where did this happen? And why does it matter to the situation? And then provide that little bit of extra detail. So when they go through the checklist, if they see there's a particular question that they haven't answered or that they haven't provided some input on, add it in, because it's just going to give us more show to assess. All right. So for me, the why is very important in these questions, the how and the why. And I find often when trainees are missing the mark with evidence, they almost are repeating what the learning outcome is. And then when I say to them, but you're not giving me the how, you're not giving me the action, right? And the why is giving me the understanding as to what makes this action appropriate in the situation. Right. Why was it appropriate for you to respond in this way, in this context? Okay. So that's a nice checklist for you to use when considering the quality of evidence. And once my trainees answered all these questions, and these are guidelines from SAICA side in terms of what the evidence must look like. Once they've covered all this, then the next level is moving into information that speaks to the determination of proficiency. Right. So when we, and again, Graham will go into a bit more detail here, but when we're looking at the professional values and attitudes, and we're considering proficiency levels, the basic, intermediate, advanced, we are considering dimensions of essentially the quantity of evidence that my trainee is presenting, and that we've got that demonstration of the PVA in complex enough scenarios. Okay, so we in a learner outcome review and in the trainee presenting evidence can't necessarily speak to the amount of times the trainees demonstrated this, the frequency of demonstration, but we do need input from the trainee in the evidence they are presenting around the context of the situation in which that PVA was demonstrated. Okay, so again, we're going to start off with, in the LR, technical work, technical context. Then we're going to identify the PVA that the trainee demonstrated. Then we're going to have the evidence coming through with all the detail of how they demonstrated the PVA and why it was appropriate in the situation and the detail around what they did. And then we need them to give us that little bit extra that helps us understand the context that the PVA was demonstrated within. And often that is linked to whether there was any prompting in the situation, or if the trainee could take initiative for the demonstration of that behavior themselves. So the context component for PVAs, my trainees must detail in the evidence, and that's going to then feed into the PDS, where the evaluator can consider the proficiency rating at that point in time, because the evaluator is going to need to consider how much evidence has come through for the PVAs, and also the context of the situation in which the PVA was demonstrated within. So if my trainee hasn't given me that information, it's going to make the evaluator's decision in the PDS almost impossible, can I call it that? They're going to have to go back and ask more questions and document more evidence. So when your reviewer is looking at this PVA evidence, we're wanting the reviewer to not just look at the quality, the who, what, where, when, why, and how, the detail, but also to make sure that the trainee has in fact provided that context and that they agree with that description of the context. Okay. When we look at the acumen, we have got 4 dimensions that we look at when considering the proficiency levels. And those dimensions the trainee needs to respond to as part of the evidence, right? So you're going to have your task understanding, your task completion, the guidance and the dependencies, and Graham will go through this in more detail with you. But when your trainee steps back, before actually sending the evidence off to the reviewer, they need to ask themselves, have they responded to each of these dimensions in the evidence that they've presented? Now, remember, for the acumens, your trainees are going to be rating themselves. And there's going to be a decision tree that they're going to follow, where they're going to need to essentially look at each of these dimensions. So they are, as part of rating themselves, considering each dimension. And as they're moving through the rating process, they've got to constantly be keeping this evidence in mind and asking themselves, have I, in this evidence, told my reviewer why I made a particular decision when rating myself, so that the reviewer can follow that train of thought, that the reviewer's got information to work with, and also that will allow the reviewer to give them valuable feedback if they are maybe disagreeing on a particular point. Okay, so that evidence in the LOR must also cover the dimensions so that we can justify the proficiency rating that is awarded in the LOR. There are other bits of information that the trainee needs to present as part of the LOR. So reflection on training that they found helpful in the process, as an example. There are other components in terms of what the trainee needs to document in the LOR, but I think the key thing, and this is what Andrew was speaking about earlier, is that for each LOR, we must make sure we at least have technical learning outcome, at least one being identified that the technical work connects to, and then at least one PVA or acumen with all the relevant detail required to constitute evidence. If it happens to be an acumen, then the additional information to cover the 4 proficiency dimensions and the rating. If it happens to just be a PVA, then the context within which that PVA was demonstrated. And then, of course, please keep in mind, we're not saying that you are limited to just one PVA or one acumen. You can include a whole lot more in an LOR, but that will be very dependent on how often you are completing your LOR. Obviously, if you're doing it weekly, you're going to have a lot less than if you're doing it monthly. And then, of course, keep in mind the fact that we have got in every PDS cycle the need to cover each of the competencies, or at least have one piece of evidence for each of the 7 competency areas. And that will be influenced by whether you have the 3, 4, or 6 month PDS cycles. And then you've got to bring into account the fact that we've got 95 PVAA learning outcomes and your own internal requirements around the extent to which you're going to develop these. And that's also going to be based on where your trainees are in their studies. If they're on 3, 4, 5-year training contracts, the extent to which these need to be developed, and how much evidence you're wanting as sufficient evidence. So those are the practical considerations that are going to be needed to be made from a training program perspective, and then fed through to trainees so that they can start giving you this evidence that is worthy of rating. I must just say that what we have seen from trainees practically so far in terms of the evidence that they've been presenting, and I'm talking about my team now and the trainees that we've been working with, there's work to be done. That's the normal work for first-year trainees, new to a training program, figuring out this whole learning evidence process. But once they get it, the quality of evidence that we're getting from trainees and the type of skills or the acumens, what we're seeing them actually doing is amazing, right? So I'm encouraged by CA 2025 providing trainees and training programs the platform to really show off the wonderful exposure that they are getting on the ground, and to not to feel limited, but to have that opportunity to go out there and find opportunities and to explore. And the trainees that are going to take advantage of all the wealth of opportunity that is in a training program is going to find this documentation of evidence so easy. Okay, we've just got to get things to click, and that includes for you as role players. Yeah, and that's, I think, my parting message for you today, before I hand over to Graham, is just that you get over the hurdle of needing to understand CA 2025. For you, those of you who said you're still unsure about it, that you get your teeth stuck in, and that you start getting excited about this and seeing the potential in this training program. All right, good. Graham, I don't know if there are questions or if you are happy to continue from here.
No, thanks, Sandra. Very happy to continue from there. Jan, thank you for that. So a lot of information to absorb in the context of CA 2025, and I think Sandra's been pretty detailed in terms of taking you through some of the practical differences, and then just that very strong emphasis around the quality of evidence. You know, I like the analogy of, you know, they need to show us what they can do, not necessarily what they know they can do. I always have another analogy that says rubbish in, rubbish out. And at the end of the day, you know, the evidence being recorded in the LORs is being used to make the decisions in the PDS. And if you've got bad information going into the PDS, then just you're going to make bad decisions at a PDS level. Okay, so let's continue with our journey. Just starting with a very high level look at formative and summative assessment. These concepts are no different to what we had in the 2016 training program. So the formative process, you know, and Sandra's taken you through that in terms of the LOR process. This will be the evidence gathering. This is the trainee going and showing us what it is they're able to do. So what behaviors were they displaying? What acumen were they using? That's regarded as formative assessment. And then that all gets accumulated in the PDS, where we now go and evaluate the acceptability of that evidence. So as Sandra was referring to for the PVAs, this is where we now start considering the complexity of the context, the frequency of demonstration. And then for the acumen, this is where we now go and start considering the sufficiency of evidence. So what ratings are coming through for a particular acumen? How many ratings are there at that level? Is it sufficient to support a decision that the trainee is able to operate at that level of proficiency? And all of this is done in the PDS at either a 3, 4, or 6 month cycle, depending on your training office. Just an observation from my side, you know, Sandra spoke about these minimum requirements for evidence in 2025, where you've got the at least once a month, you know, for at least one of the PVAAs, and then covering the 7 competency areas. Sandra made mention of, you know, that in her opinion, and I support it, is probably not going to be adequate. You know, the once a month. So what do trainees do? Do they now wait until the end of the month before they then go and try and remember everything they've done during the month? I don't think that's really going to work in the context of what we're expecting from trainees here. So do they then go and create these documents at the end of every week and then go and reflect on the week and what they've demonstrated during that week and then record the evidence? I wouldn't be suggesting they're submitting the evidence for review every week, but they're certainly updating the LOR on a continuous basis. At the end of the month, they can then submit the evidence to the reviewer. I would even go one step further, and maybe I'm just a little bit of an optimist by nature and looking at an ideal scenario. You know, in an ideal situation, trainees get home from work every day, they reflect on what happened during that day, and they go and update the LOR for the behaviors they've displayed during that day, or the acumen they've used during that day. That might be a little bit onerous, but you know, we might find some trainees taking that kind of approach. There was a comment in the chat there in terms of, can you require more frequent completion of documents? You absolutely can. So like we had in the old training program, SAICA prescribed the minimum requirements for completion, but you're able to go and do more than that, and even include assessment policy decisions that are more prescriptive more onerous than what SAICA requires. Yeah, Karina, I just see the question and the comment there. It's not going to be late if it's done, well, a month later. So just be a little bit careful about this. So the requirement is submit evidence at least one PVAA each month. So when we come to now the end of a month, if a trainee delays the submission of the LOR until the end of the month, they will still meet the SAICA requirement. They have recorded evidence in respect of that month. In terms of the lateness, now we need to start coming in and looking at, well, how long do you give trainees to submit the evidence, to create the LOR and submit it for review? And then how long do you give your reviewers to go and review the evidence and feed it back to the trainee? And then how long do you give your trainees to wrap up the LOR and finalize the LOR? The only sort of context of late is where a trainee doesn't include evidence in a month for at least one PVAA. That's the minimum requirement. And in terms of the non-performance, if you like, it would be where a trainee doesn't have an LOR in relation to a particular month. The timiest turnaround of that is going to be monitored internally within the training office. Okay, so let's then get into what I'm really looking forward to, kind of giving you some feedback on some of these more tricky PVAAs. And I think, right up front, it's critical to emphasize the importance of all role players having the same, and dare I say, correct understanding of the PVAAs. If your trainees and reviewers are on different pages in terms of what a particular PVAA means, if your reviewers and evaluators are on different pages in terms of what these things mean, you're going to encounter all sorts of problems. You might have a trainee submitting evidence that is acceptable, but the reviewer now rejects it because the reviewer doesn't understand the PVA or the acumen. So I think within each training office, it's going to be absolutely critical that you take steps to ensure that everyone is on the same page in terms of what these PVAAs mean, and therefore what would be acceptable for trainees to submit in the context of these PVAAs. Now, SAICA has gone and provided, I think, a pretty useful guidance document to try and establish this common understanding amongst all role players. It is one of the documents that was sent through to you, this document called the CA 2025 PVAAs in Practice. And I'm just showing it on the screen at the moment. But just to scroll down a little bit, and I will make it a bit bigger so you can see here, just to go and emphasize what this document includes, because I think there's some really, really good guidance that can be picked up from this document. The document takes every single individual learning outcome, all 95 of the PVAAs. It indicates the level of proficiency they need to achieve by the end of the training contract term. And then it's really this third column that I think becomes so valuable. It goes and gives a suggestion around what this particular PVA or acumen means. What could this look like in practice? What would this require the trainee to do? This document it was developed over the course of a fairly lengthy time period during the course of last year. The training program working committee is going to be re-looking at this document over the course of the next couple of months. It is kind of going to be a work in progress document. I think as we get more feedback, as we get more awareness of what these things are about, we'll be able to make this document better and better. But I think as a starting point to get everyone on the same page, this would be a useful reference point for both trainees and reviewers and evaluators and assessors. What's also quite nice about it is it goes and gives some examples of what evidence trainees could provide to be able to display this particular behavior or use this particular acumen. And the examples are split between client engagement, which are more typically audit specific, and then also examples in the right-hand column where rotations are used. So probably more relevant to a commerce and industry or a state-owned entity kind of environment where you're rotating trainees from department to department. The examples are not expressed in the form that they would be acceptable from a quality point of view. The examples are there more as a demonstration of what the PVA means and giving trainees some sort of direction in terms of what they could utilize as evidence. they would obviously need to take, any of these examples they choose to use, and then the way they present the evidence, as Sandra indicated, would need to be sufficiently specific and detailed and show that this display of behavior does actually demonstrate this particular PVA or this particular acumen. Okay, so I just wanted you to be aware of this document. I think it's going to be a pretty good starting point to getting everyone on the same page. So just before I start going in and having a look at the selection of these more difficult PVAAs, just this importance of lifelong learning and staying up to date. I mean, Neo made the point earlier in the presentation that for all of us, CA 2025 is new, and irrespective of our role, we have an obligation to be informed enough to be able to adequately fulfill our role. So as much as it's important that trainees are familiar with the PVAAs, it's just as important that reviewers are and that evaluators and assessors are. So I think for each of us individually, we've got a commitment that needs to come through in terms of becoming familiar with these PVAAs. I do accept it is a new process, a new training program. There's quite a lot to get up to speed on. And I think Neo, again, will talk to this a little bit later in terms of flexibility when training office visits are conducted. I think in the back of SAICA's mind, there's very much an acceptance that this is a new training program. There is going to be a learning curve. And I don't think SAICA are going to be overly prescriptive in terms of what they find in training office visits. But Neo will give you more information about that a little bit later on. So the reference in terms of this last bullet point for trainees in particular, I mean, they're the ones who have the obligation to display the behavior, record the evidence. The onus is really on them to make sure that they understand the particular PVA or acumen to be able to then go and submit appropriate evidence. So I think even just becoming familiar with the PVAAs in itself, demonstrates a commitment to lifelong learning for trainees. I'm going to then go and have a look at certain of the PVAAs. I hope the ones that I've selected are the ones that you equally find to be challenging. If there are any others that you find are challenging and I've not covered those, you're more than welcome to let me know in the chat function. And if we've got time, I can spend a little bit of time on those. So let's dive into some of these more tricky PVAAs. So I'm going to start with the PVAs and then obviously work through a couple of those and then move into the acumen and work through a couple of those. So first off, business ethics B. Demonstrate how you contributed to the ethical culture of your business environment. So trainees are having to submit evidence of their ability to display this particular behavior. And the behavior here is a contribution to the ethical culture. So whatever it is that the trainee displays must show how it contributes to making the ethical culture stronger or reinforcing the ethical culture. And just note, it's of your business environment. So it would be of the training office, essentially. So what is the trainee doing to commit to the ethical culture of the training office? And I mean, obviously that document that I shared on the screen with you will give examples of this. But I think just at a high level, it's important to understand what we mean by the ethical culture of any environment. We talk about organizational culture, and then we can kind of deviate from there into what we mean by an ethical culture. But essentially, if you start with an organizational culture, you could kind of sum it up as, this is the way we do things around here. That's the organizational culture, the way we do things. So if we extend that to what we mean by an ethical culture, it's the way we do things right around here. It's the way we do things in a manner that upholds ethical principles. And it's really a mindset within the organization around the display and demonstration and commitment to ethical behavior. Typically, ethical cultures can be both formal and informal. The formal elements of ethical cultures are quite easy. They are the policies, the procedures, the value statements, the mission statements. So trainees might be able to go and show how particular behavior reinforces a corporate value, for example, that's aligned to ethics. or how the display of certain behavior reinforces principles around ethical behavior. The reporting of unethical conduct, for example. If they're able to do that and follow the training officer's guidelines around that, then they would be contributing to the ethical culture. They're following the process, they're making the business environment a more ethical culture. I think for me, what's more fascinating in terms of ethical cultures, though, is the elements that are more referred to as the informal aspects. And, you know, these are, again, they're all things that drive the way we do things here, but they're like the role models. You know, they're the stories that get chatted about around the water cooler, or if you're someone like me, outside while having a smoke break. You know, it's the stories kind of coming through. Yes, did you hear what happened? You know, last week, this partner, the situation they were in, and did you hear what they did to respond to that situation? Yes, I can't believe it. I don't know if I'd be able to do that, but I mean, you can almost see the halo around the partner's head. That the behavior was phenomenal. I mean, they withstood that pressure. They refused to bow down. I'm really glad to be working for an organization that has people like this. You know, so it's kind of the success stories that get shared. And it's this kind of joint collaboration of effort towards doing the right thing always. So, you know, it's fairly open-ended here in terms of how trainees might be able to go and display this particular behavior, but hopefully that gives you some insight into it. Obviously, the SAICA, PVAAs, and practice guidance document will give you a little bit more information. But for me, the key thing here is whatever they described they did, they would need to show how that contributed to either maintaining the appropriate ethical culture or growing, developing, making the ethical culture stronger. You know, so things like, and I've seen this in assessor training, going and submitting an annual ethics declaration. I'm not convinced that that shows how you're contributing to the ethical culture of your business environment. But going along and performing behavior that upholds ethical principles, that are aligned to corporate values, that are in line with ethics policies and procedures within the organization, that create these stories of ethical behavior, that in my mind is more how this particular behavior is going to be demonstrated. Okay, next up, citizenship. So in citizenship, we've got three groups of citizenship. There's personal, corporate, and professional. And I think just this concept of citizenship is sometimes misunderstood. You know, we always think of citizenship in terms of, well, being citizens of a country. And we are. I mean, we're citizens of South Africa. So what does that mean, citizenship of South Africa? Well, it means we've got certain duties and obligations toward our country. There are certain laws and rules and regulations that our country prescribes that we're obligated to uphold. But also maybe it's bigger than that. You know, do we have an obligation to take pride in our country, give back to our country, grow our country, make our country a better place for everyone that lives in it? And I think there's an aspect of citizenship that deals with that. So when we take this concept of citizenship and bring it down into a personal, corporate, and professional context, personal citizenship as a starting point, and we'll look at corporate citizenship shortly. But this is basically recognizing that as an individual, you work and live with others. You live in a particular community, and personal citizenship suggests there is an obligation that you work within that community and you work to give back to that community and you work to uplift that community. And we see this as, you know, as the role of the future CA. I mean, you all know about our primary driving goal being to protect the public interest. And, you know, one way we can demonstrate that we do protect the public interest, we're aware of the public interest, we look after the public interest, is by giving back. So personal citizenship is going to be giving back in your individual capacity. So, you know, this particular one, if we look at the wording of this behavior, evaluate. Okay, so look at pros, cons, come up with an assessment, a conclusion of some form for a specific course of action So that could be any course of action, anything done by anyone in an individual capacity. It doesn't have to be something the trainee has done. Evaluate the impact of that action on the community in which the trainee lives and works and on the local environment. Okay, so something happens. Is the trainee able to then go and evaluate the impact of that thing that has happened on the community in which they live and work? So just recognizing the impact of action on local communities where the trainee is based. Now, this would be recorded directly into the LOR. This is not going to be done in a typical working paper. Yeah, I mean, it's really just the trainee staying up to date with what is happening and then going and recognizing, okay, this thing has happened. This is the impact of this kind of behavior on the community in which I live and where I work. From a corporate citizenship point of view, just before going into some of the detail in here, you know, personal citizenship, the individual role in terms of giving back within the communities in which you live and work. You're also, though, an employee of a company, an organization, and companies have a citizenship obligation. They have a duty toward the stakeholders they represent. I mean, King 4 makes a big point about this in terms of this role of Ubuntu and companies having a role to play in uplifting societies and giving back to communities. So corporate citizenship recognizes that you're an employee of this organization. So you're expected to get involved in the corporation's initiatives to give back. So your corporate social responsibility initiatives, are trainees committed to those? Do they get involved in those? Are they actively participating in those? But there are two here in particular under corporate citizenship that sometimes I think create uncertainty. And this first one is this weighing up short-term financial benefits against long-term strategic or societal impacts of decisions. So what does that mean? Now, you've got to go to King 4 really to get, I think, a good sense of what this means. It's coming into the role that companies play in societies, and it's starting to talk to the company's long-term sustainability goals. If we're talking short-term financial benefits, so short-term profit making versus long-term strategic or societal impacts of decisions. I always recall an interview that SAICA had with Mike Brown, the CEO of Nedbank. This was a couple of years ago. It's an interesting video to watch. I think it's still on the SAICA platform. But basically, it was a conversation with Mike Brown about ethics in our country and where we sit as a country from an ethics point of view. But outside of ethics, he made an observation that I've quoted so many, many times. He spoke about the role of the CEO being to maximize the present value of all future earnings of the organization. And I think it's such a nice way to sum up this particular learning outcome. Okay, maximizing the present value of all future earnings, because that's a very different viewpoint to short-term profit optimization. You might be faced with a decision that would make a lot of profit for the company in the short term, but what are the long-term consequences to that decision? What are the impacts of that decision on stakeholders down the line? And, sometimes maximizing profit in the short term isn't actually going to maximize the present value of all future earnings for that entity over the long term. So this is basically requiring trainees to demonstrate an understanding of this kind of thinking in the context of the role of corporations. So they could apply this to any decision made by any organization. It could be the training office, it could be a department, it could be a client, where they'd go and take a look at a decision that's been made and go and weigh up, evaluate, the implications. Is this decision seeking to maximize short-term profit, or is it seeking to maximize long-term sustainable value for that organization? So, it's quite a tricky one to get your mind around, and again, trainees are going to need to look for opportunities to do this. And again, it can be in terms of any decision. You know, you make a decision to give a salary increase to staff. You know, what amount of increase are you giving? What if that increase is below par, below expectation? Now, in the short term, that might maximize profit because you're obviously minimizing your wage bill or your salary bill. But the long-term implications of that, in terms of loyalty of staff, in terms of potential employees leaving, we've seen in South Africa, it's so prevalent, strike action and the potential for that. What impression it creates of the organization in the public eye, you know, if you're not giving reasonable wage or salary increases, and what impact might that have on customers in the future, on suppliers. So yeah, even a decision as relatively straightforward as a chosen salary or wage increase, you know, there's this ability to weigh up the short-term implications of a decision like that versus the more long-term implications of a decision like that. The second learning outcome under corporate citizenship is to do with evaluating an organization's strategy and business model, but in the context of the SDGs. Now, the actual SAICA wording doesn't include what I've put in brackets there. I've just reminded you of what the SDGs are. Very often when I have conversations with people about the training program, they don't understand this learning outcome because they don't know what the SDGs are. Now, I mean, you can go and do the research, and in the interest of what we were speaking about earlier, you know, this lifelong learning. On the screen here, I've just brought up the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program website around these Sustainable Development Goals. It goes in and describes what they are. There are 17 of these. And then below this, you've got a whole long list of these things. Each of these you can look at it in more detail, but these are the SDGs. These are worldwide development goals that we're looking to try and work towards achieving. So reducing poverty, reducing hunger, promoting good health, good quality education, gender equality, and so it goes on. I mean, we can scroll down the list here. There are 17 of these SDGs. So for trainees to be able to go and display this particular behavior, they would clearly need an understanding of what the SDGs are. If you understand what the SDGs are, then it's not that difficult to go and evaluate. So to what degree or not does the organization's strategy align with these SDGs? Is the company committed to working on these SDGs, to feeding into these SDGs? Okay, and I think if you understand the SDGs, this learning outcome then becomes much easier to understand. And then I think not difficult for trainees to go along and demonstrate. They could do this in the context of your organization. So the training office. How aligned is the training office to the SDGs? Are there commitments in terms of training office strategy towards working towards these SDGs? Or they could apply it in the context of clients or business units that they're working in. Okay, then next up we have the business internal environment, the first of the acumen. This one talks pretty much to what we saw earlier in the context of corporate citizenship, this business model. So this could be of the training office, or it could be a client, it could be a business unit. Are they driven by short-term business success, or are they driven by long-term value creation? And with reference to the 6 capitals is a reference to the 6 capitals coming through in King 4. So this is really just more modern thinking around business models, how companies create value through the inputs, the business activities, and the outputs that they generate. Trainees may need to go and do some research on this to be able to be comfortable with what this means, because if you don't know what this means, how are you going to evaluate it? But again, that SAICA guidance document, the BVAAs in practice, would give some insight into what this is about and would give trainees examples of how they might be able to go and demonstrate this. But this is now looking not so much at a particular business decision and the impact of that business decision on profitability versus long-term sustainability. It's more looking at the actual business model of the client, the way in which the client does business. Is it driven by generating profit for primarily the one capital, financial capital, the shareholders as the primary stakeholder? Or does the business see business success being driven by maximizing the 6 capitals and not just financial capital? Okay, so that's this first business internal environment learning outcome. Then we have emotional intelligence, quite an unusual inclusion, as some of you might think. Typically as accountants, and I always have a sort of a chuckle to myself where, when we look at the typical accountant, we're seen as these fairly dry, gray individuals with our gray outfits and our gray briefcases doing fairly gray things. And we're not really seen as emotional beings. This emotional intelligence doesn't require that we become statues and marble-like in our lack of emotion. It's more a focus on how do we manage emotion. I think when we talk emotional intelligence versus intelligence, intellectual intelligence, I've got no doubt that all of us are intellectually intelligent. You can't pass the kind of exams that you need to without that. But this is something different. And this is all around the ability to manage emotions in an appropriate way. How do you deal with anger? How do you deal with frustration? How do you deal with loss, with disappointment? And I've no doubt all of you have been in situations where you've experienced frustration. Whether it's not getting the answers you're looking for, whether it's constantly being fobbed off and being told to come back later when they're ready. We're entitled to emotions, and frustration is a valid emotion in those circumstances. The question is, how do we deal with it? How do we display that emotion in a positive manner? And that's what this emotional intelligence is about. Next up is the digital acumen. And there are a couple of these that I want to just touch base with you on. And this first one, I think, has caused a lot of concern amongst training officers. When we sort of read this, write a basic algorithm. So an algorithm would basically be a computer program, a set of instructions to solve a problem using any programming language. And this is where the panic sets in, because now we're saying, okay, are we now expecting trainees to become software programmers? Do they need to now learn coding and then go along and actually code solutions to problems? And particularly when we look at the examples that SAICA provide here, such as Microsoft VBA, Python. Now, Python is a very specific programming language. You could add to this things like C++, and there are a number of these programming languages out there. So at first glance, this becomes a challenge. And we're thinking, how are my trainees supposed to do this? The universities don't teach them how to use programming languages. So do they now need to go and self-study in terms of a programming language? No. And I think the light at the end of the tunnel for this one is when we go and have a look at that PDF document that I showed earlier, the PVAAs in practice. And we look at some of the examples that SAICA provide there. And it comes into the learning outcomes, such as Microsoft VBA. And I'm going to give you 2 possibilities here where using Microsoft, you would be able to go and do this relatively easily. The first of those is Microsoft Excel. Now, any programming language, I think there'd be an argument that if an algorithm is a set of instructions to go and execute a series of code, what about Excel formulas? If you're able to go along and put together, and they would need to, I imagine, be fairly complex Excel formulas, would that count as a basic algorithm to solve a problem? And if we're talking here, the kind of things I'm thinking are these if-then, kind of programming formulas, for example. So you're looking to analyze a set of information and you're going along and applying these formulas. If this, then do that. And then depending on the outcome to that, then do this. And if it isn't that, then do this. And I mean, I've seen some pretty complex if-then formulas being created to go and extract information that's needed. Would that count? Why not? We are talking a basic algorithm, so we're not talking complex sets of instructions here. So if a trainee is able to use certain Excel formulas to go along and solve a problem, they're able to demonstrate this learning outcome. There's another option that could be made available to trainees in terms of dealing with this one. And again, using Microsoft as an example, Excel macros. So are you able to get your trainees to go along and write macros to perform certain executable programs? So you bring data into an Excel sheet and you then go and write a macro to basically filter the data or sort the data or extract the data, analyze the data, picking up outliers, picking up exceptions to parameters that you've got predetermined. So if a trainee is able to go along and write an Excel macro to then execute an algorithm to solve a problem, then surely they're doing this. You know, we've got to also just bear in mind that the bigger picture here, this concept of computational thinking is in the context of problem solving. The description of computational thinking is the ability to basically understand and solve a problem in a manner that a computer would. So computer programming is a fairly logical thought process in terms of coming up with a desired outcome. And computational thinking is a skill set that enables you to problem solve in a similar way. So, you know, provided you can go and write an Excel formula that comes up with a solution to a problem, or design an Excel macro to come up with a solution to a problem, you would have to apply computational thinking to be able to do that. Okay, and that's kind of giving you some flexibility here in terms of this one. I think what we are going to also start seeing happening over time is, you know, as training officers start working with these acumen, particularly the digital acumen, you know, we're going to start seeing solutions to these acumen. We're going to start coming up with innovative ways to actually deal with these and provide evidence to demonstrate these. I think from SAICA's point of view, they're going to be regarding this as a continuous process. I have no doubt the content of the training program is going to be looked at, I imagine, several times over the course of the next couple of years. You know, maybe there are better ways to word these. So yeah, this is the basic algorithm. I actually don't think it's going to be a challenge. Do you see a chat just coming through there? Is this prescriptive, this writing a basic algorithm? Yes, because remember the 95 PVAAs are all prescriptive. So we don't anymore have compulsories and electives and residuals. You don't have the ability to choose between these things. All trainees would need to display the required exit level proficiency in all 95 of the PVAs and acumens. So yes, this together with all of the ones that I've been going through are prescriptive. Not prescriptive in the form of how you display the evidence, but prescriptive in the sense that evidence would need to be presented. Okay, as to how the evidence is presented and what form the evidence would take, that's where the flexibility comes in. Okay, so next up then we have automation. And once again, when we go and start thinking about what we mean by automation, the panic starts to set in. We're now looking at automation / modernization of information systems. Essentially, and automation is having computers do things that typically would be done manually previously. Things that people would be doing, we're now going and bringing computers in to do what they were doing. So we're then thinking, well, do trainees now have to use automated systems? No. I mean, look at the wording of this. Look at the verbs in particular here. Identify processes that lend themselves to automation. Okay, so all you've got to do as a trainee is recognize a currently manual, labor-intensive process that could do with considering automation, and you've dealt with this learning outcome. The digital acumen do require trainees to stay current in terms of their understanding of emerging technology. In the PVAs, the lifelong learning PVAs, when we come to self-development, there is this behavior that trainees need to demonstrate where they are staying up to date with emerging trends, including trends in relation to digital developments. So I do think for a lot of these, it's going to require that trainees are relatively up to date with what is happening in the wider world in the context of digital developments. I don't know that you would necessarily be able to do some of these if you weren't up to date with what is happening out there. And I mean, isn't this what we would expect of future CAs? I mean, I'm sure all of you, won't put you to the test, but I'm sure all of you have your news feeds, you have your subscriptions that you're regularly getting feedback on, keeping you up to date with developments that affect your particular job or your particular industry. We need to get trainees to start doing that now. They should be subscribing to newsletters, news feeds that keep them up to date with emerging technology. If they're aware of the technology, they're then going to be able to apply that awareness in displaying a lot of these digital acumen. Okay, so this first one around automation is not actually that challenging. And I think trainees will come across multiple instances where there are typically fairly labor-intensive processes that could benefit from automation. And all they're having to do is identify the particular process that would benefit from automation. The second one under automation also initially raises alarm bells when we start talking about cognitive computing systems. Now, I mean, when this first came through, I had to do a little bit of lifelong learning myself to go and figure out what we mean by cognitive computing systems. But in essence, these are computing systems that are programmed to emulate human thinking. So essentially, they go and do decision-making in the way that a human being would make decisions. So typically, we're coming into things like, just as an example, I mean, there are a lot of different cognitive computing systems, but things like voice recognition and text recognition. And I'm always nervous to go this route, but the whole "Hey Siri" thing, and I'm nervous about it because usually when I say that, my little phone pops up and says, "Yes, how can I help you?" But that's effectively cognitive computing. So Siri, bless her, bless it, recognizes what I'm asking, and then 99 times out of 100 gives me an appropriate response. But that voice recognition and the designed response is cognitive computing. Going on to websites, particularly websites where there are entities that have a large customer base. They don't have the infrastructure to be able to take calls, so you can't speak to a human, but you can go into their help function and you can type your question into the help function. And as soon as you activate their help function, you get a little message coming up, "Hi, I'm Ernie, how can I help you?" And you then type your question in and Ernie then gives you a response. Okay, usually it's not always the most appropriate response, but nonetheless, that's a form of cognitive computing. So look at the wording again in this learning outcome. Evaluate the need for. So in doing that, there's going to be an answer that we achieve. Either there is a need for this or there is not a need for this. So when we go and look at automation processes, so we've identified processes that lend themselves to automation, we now go and consider this and say, okay, there's something that would benefit from automation, or there's something that is currently automated. Is there any need to introduce cognitive computing systems into that automation process? And to be able to do this, clearly you need to understand cognitive computing and what we mean by that. But I think for trainees that do the research and are relatively au fait with what we mean by cognitive computing, it's really not a big ask to then go and say, well, here's an automation process. Would there be any value in introducing cognitive computing? They don't have to introduce it. They don't have to use it. They have to evaluate the need for it. Okay, and in some instances, there might well be a need for it, and that would be the outcome of the evaluation. But I would think in most instances, the outcome of the evaluation would be, we've considered this, and there is no need to introduce cognitive computing. There wouldn't be the desired value coming from that. Okay, so I don't think these two automation tasks are going to create too much of a challenge if we have the right understanding and if everyone is on the same page in terms of that understanding. Okay, what about these W5 learning outcomes, the new developments and protocols? So this one also usually causes panic because it says use new developments and protocols. So does that mean we have to then be using emerging technology as trainees? I mean, they may get the opportunity to do that. Your training office might introduce new technology that trainees are then able to use. But look at the example in brackets behind. It doesn't actually require the trainee to use those new developments. E.g., identify opportunities where you could use new developments to address accounting, business problems, limitations, risks. So if you can go as a trainee and identify a situation that would benefit from introducing new developments and protocols, then you've dealt with this learning outcome. Now, to be able to do this, trainees must be up to date with emerging technology. They would need to have an understanding of what developments and protocols are out there to be able to identify opportunities to potentially apply them. I mean, just by way of example, and I've used this example several times, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but I read an article a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago. It was in the context of agriculture, and it was basically around this country in the Middle East that had developed this technology. And I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of technology where they have sensors in the ground and they're able to then measure moisture and that kind of stuff. These sensors go a step further. They actually mount these things on trees. Okay, so it's suited to any kind of farming that's involving trees, so fruit and nuts typically. These sensors then monitor moisture level, nutritional components within individual trees. So this is then all connected up to obviously a platform, and the farmer is then actually able to identify which particular trees need water, need nutrients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just from a cost effectiveness point of view, you don't have to now go and water the whole plantation if it doesn't all need to be watered. And if there are only certain patches of the plantation that need nitrogen or whatever it might be, well, then you can address that. Okay, so there's an example of a new development. Now, if I'm then in an audit context and I have a client who happens to be growing fruit or nuts or something like that, can I then take what I've learned and identify whether there is now an opportunity for that agricultural client to possibly use that new development? If I can link the two, then I've demonstrated this learning outcome. Okay, so again, I don't think this is going to be a difficult one for trainees to demonstrate. It is going to require that they stay current with emerging technology, but if they do that, the ability to then go and identify opportunities to apply technology is pretty limitless, actually. So let me then come into the two where I do think there is going to be a problem. And the first of those is this one. I mean, just in red, apply in a non-complex simulation. For that almost, well, not almost, it does. It presupposes the only way to achieve this learning outcome is through running a non-complex simulation. I can kind of understand that because when you look at the actual learning outcome, the ability to apply control activities over selected new developments, I just don't see trainees doing this in practice. So there is a conversation that is going to be happening, and I've already started to engage in this conversation with SAICA. Why are we including a learning outcome that can only be demonstrated through a simulation? This is supposed to be a practical training program. Why do we have things in the training program that can't actually be done? That's one question that I think we need to engage in and find an answer to. The other part to this question is, if SAICA believe this is so important that trainees need practical exposure to this, well, then who's going to provide this non-complex simulation? just practically doesn't make sense that you've got all 700 training officers going and developing their own non-complex simulations to achieve this. So does SAICA possibly have a role to play in providing these non-complex simulations? Possibly. And this is another conversation that is happening currently within SAICA. So I think we're going to get more information about this one. But personally, it's going to be, I think, extremely rare that you would be able to give trainees the opportunity to do this. What I'm usually recommending to people is just defer this one for now, and let's see what solutions SAICA comes up with. And there's two possibilities. The one is the learning outcome is removed, or it's amended, or SAICA provide a solution. So I would anticipate that by the end of the year, at the latest, there would be more clarity about this one. Okay, so my recommendation is park this one for now. Don't create expectations of proficiency in this learning outcome just yet. Delay those until later in the contract term. Okay, then the second one, which I think is also potentially going to create challenges, is this W6 cybersecurity one. And, it's not a concern to me in terms of the ability to apply cybersecurity processes on local devices. But we have that in the user competencies. In the user competencies W7, we've got trainees needing to display their ability to protect information on their local devices, whether those are phones or tablets or notebooks. This particular learning outcome is looking at a much higher level of cybersecurity on the organization. And that means we're talking the organization's servers, databases. We're talking techniques here to prevent ransomware and data hacking. And once again, like the previous one, I just don't see trainees getting involved in this. This is what you have your IT specialists for. I don't know that you would necessarily want to unleash your trainees on your cybersecurity processes to prevent ransomware. Sure, make them aware of them, but get them to actually apply these processes. I've got a big question mark about this one. And pretty much along the same lines as the previous one that apply in a non-complex simulation, this one is currently up for debate. It is being considered by SAICA, and this is another one that I would recommend you park for now. I think it would be quite rare that trainees would get the opportunity to do this. Okay, so you'll get more information about this in due course. And then just the last one is under the user competencies, these visualization techniques. Sometimes there's not really clarity in terms of, well, what do we mean by this? So, all we're looking at here is visualization of data. So I think trainees would do this very frequently. They're going to be using Excel. There are a whole lot of digital acumen around data analytics. Even around things like critical thinking and obtaining data and analyzing data to be able to make decisions. All this is requiring trainees to do is to say, well, can you take that data and represent it in a visual format? It's sometimes more palatable in that format and sometimes even makes more sense. So if you're doing pre-engagement activities in an audit context, for example, and you're doing ratio analysis and trend analysis, can you represent that movement in ratios, that movement in trends over time visually? So put it into a graph or a pie chart or a bar chart or something. That would be applying visualization techniques. Okay, so I don't think it's going to be, again, overly challenging for trainees to display this one. Okay. Good people, we have been going for an hour and 10 since our last break, and I think we're at a point where next up I'm going to go in and take you through the decision trees in a bit more detail. But I think before we go into that next topic for discussion, I think let's take our second comfort break for the morning. So I'm going to deem it to be 11 o'clock. If I could please ask that we resume at 11:15. That will give you just under 15 minutes again. I'm just going to pop that into the chat box. I'll change the slideshow. But yeah, head off, take your second morning comfort break. When we come back, we'll go into the last hour and a quarter together, and starting with the decision trees and these proficiency matrices. Enjoy the break and see you in just under 15 minutes. All right, everyone, and welcome back in after the second conference break. So let's get into our last hour and a quarter. So I'm going to now take you through the decision trees. To understand the decision trees, you need to understand the proficiency matrices. And just to share on the screen with you, the document that I'm going to be referring to here is this document, the Assessing Proficiency Using the Decision Trees document. You'll see in this document, if I just scroll down here, we've got in the first instance, the professional values and attitudes. And in here, you've got the proficiency matrix is what it's called. And you'll see in this matrix, you've got the 3 different levels of proficiency, the foundational, intermediate, and advanced that Sandra spoke about. And then you've got what we call dimensions that affect the level of proficiency. And for the PVAs, we've got 2 dimensions, the frequency of demonstration and the context within which the behavior was demonstrated, the situation in which they displayed the behavior. If I scroll down in this document, you'll see then we've got the acumen coming through on page 6, and the same kind of thing. We've got the 3 levels of proficiency, and we've got this time 4 dimensions that are considered in determining whether the behavior, the use of the acumen is at a foundational level or an intermediate level or an advanced level. And Sandra spoke about these in terms of the task understanding, the task completion, the guidance, and the dependencies. So I'm going to work through these with you and just explain to you what these mean. But I just wanted you to be aware of this document in the background, which provides the guidance around these considerations. Okay, so when we come to the PVAs as the starting point, the 2 dimensions in the proficiency matrix are firstly the frequency with which behavior is displayed. Now, frequency, I mean, I don't think I need to really explain this. I mean, how often, how much evidence is there? And you'll just see in the slideshow, this clearly can't be measured in a learning outcomes review. One reviewer who is considering evidence submitted by a trainee for behavior of the PVAs can't determine frequency because they don't know what other evidence has been submitted. And this is part of the reason why we can't use a decision tree for the PVAs at an LOR level. We can only consider frequency when we look at the accumulation of evidence. Then we can determine how much evidence, how often has the behavior been displayed. And that kind of, sliding scale between foundational and advanced frequency would be at a foundational level, occasional demonstration of the behavior, whereas advanced frequency would be a reference to regular display of the behavior, multiple displays of the behavior. Okay, so the first dimension for the PVAs is how much evidence is there? How often has the behavior been displayed? The second indicator of proficiency, though, is then the context. So this, and Sandra's made reference to this, this has to be described in the LOR because as an evaluator, to make a decision about the rating to be awarded to the PVAs, you need to understand the context, the situation in which the behavior was displayed. So it's recorded in the LOR, but we then use this information at the PDS level to determine the rating of proficiency. What do we mean by context? And the proficiency matrix talks about the complexity of the context, the complexity of the situation that the trainee was in when they displayed the behavior. And we differentiate here between what we regard as fairly simple, straightforward situations or contexts, and then more difficult, more advanced, more complex situations. How do you determine whether a situation is simple, straightforward, or is more complex? The primary guidance given around this one is the degree to which the trainee has responsibility for performing that particular assignment, for performing the situation. Is the trainee, for example, simply following instructions? Is the trainee doing something that someone else has determined what needs to be done? There's no responsibility for decision-making on the trainee's part. There's no autonomy in terms of the trainee being able to decide what needs to be done, how to do it, and then go and do it. Those are simple situations. And typically these kinds of foundational contexts do exist in the early stages of most training contracts. Trainees are still learning the ropes in terms of the work assignments they're undertaking, and it's unlikely in the early stages that there would be high levels of context. But as the trainees become more experienced and be given more responsibility, the complexity of the situations then starts to increase. And advanced contexts would be typically a situation where the trainee is autonomous. They are able to make their own decisions. They choose what needs to be done, how to do it, and then they go off and do it. They're not relying on someone else to determine what has to be done. Okay, and those situations where the trainees are taking responsibility for the situations are what we refer to as more advanced contexts. Now, as you can see at the PDS level, if the evaluators don't have the information about the context, they're not going to be able to consider it. In the EAT, when trainees are recording evidence, this is a required element that trainees need to describe. So they're not only describing their behavior, they're also having to describe the context to that behavior. What was the complexity of the situation in which they've gone and displayed the behavior? So then at a PDS level, we've then got a couple of questions that the decision tree will guide us through. And the first question is going to be, okay, you've seen this accumulated evidence for the PVAs coming through. What's your viewpoint about the frequency of demonstration? Do you think frequency is at a foundational level? In other words, there's only occasional display of the behavior, or do you believe frequency is more advanced? The trainee is able to display the behavior in multiple situations numerous times. Having asked the first question, then we're going to have to answer the second question, which is around the complexity of the context. Is the context advanced/intermediate, or is the context foundational? Having asked those two questions, the decision tree is then going to arrive at a potential rating of proficiency. So we've considered frequency, we've considered context. Based on that, let's assume we come up with a level 2 rating, intermediate. We then ask a third question. Is there anything else that we're aware of that might suggest the trainee is not able to continue at that level 2 into the future? Okay, so we answer frequency, we answer context, that determines a rating of proficiency, and then we do a kind of a double check here. It's pointing to a level 2. Is there anything else that would suggest they're not able to continue at level 2? Okay, and then if there isn't, we would then award the level 2 rating. If there is something to suggest they might not be able to continue at that level, then we would give them the lower rating of proficiency. Okay, and that's essentially what's happening with the PVAs. For the acumen, it's, I think, a little bit more complicated. So firstly, with the acumen, we measure those 4 dimensions in the LOR. So those issues of guidance and task completion and task understanding and task dependencies are LOR ratings. We don't use those 4 dimensions in the PDS. Okay, and I'll take you through what we do use in the PDS. Okay, so when we go and look at the evidence submitted by a trainee, they're then going to, in the first instance, apply their mind to these 4 dimensions, and they're going to go and rate their own proficiency in those acumen. That would then be submitted to the reviewer, as Sandra said, who would then need to go and corroborate the evidence and confirm or disagree with the trainee's rating of proficiency in the acumen. So we need to clearly understand what we mean by these 4 dimensions. So let's do that. And just I found this quite interesting. When we look at these 4 dimensions, there's actually only one of them that relates to the display of the acumen. 3 of them relate to the situation, the work context or the professional context that the trainee is operating within. And remember, Sandra made this point very apparent. We're giving trainees exposure to work opportunities, work assignments, professional assignments. These can be jobs, these can be in-house things, they can be projects, anything done in a professional capacity. While trainees are performing these assignments, they're then going to be using acumen in the performance of these assignments. Okay, one of the 4 dimensions is going to speak to their use of the acumen, and the other 3 are going to speak to the assignment. Okay, work, professional, whatever you want to call it, technical, questions about that particular context. So let's go in and have a closer look at these 4 dimensions. They are explained in that PDF document, so I'm just giving you the kind of the high-level overview of these. Okay, so the first question we're going to have to ask about the LOR acumen is around guidance. Now, this one is pretty straightforward because it's pretty similar to what we had in the old decision trees. So in the old decision trees, the first question we always asked was, did the trainee receive guidance? We're asking a similar question here. And this, of the 4 questions, is the only one that relates to the use of the acumen. Did they need guidance in terms of how to use the acumen? Okay, not did they need guidance in terms of how to perform the work assignment or the professional assignment? Okay, that's not what we're talking about here. So if we're looking at an acumen, like, for example, the ability to work effectively as part of a team, or an acumen, the ability to use spreadsheet software, did trainees need to be told how to work as part of a team or how to use Excel? Okay, not did they need to be told how to do the assignment they've been given to do. That's a different issue. Okay, and of the 4 questions, this is the only one that relates to the acumen. So the next 3 questions then give clarity, and mostly around the complexity of the situation, the assignment in which the trainee is then using to display the acumen. So first up of those is this thing we call task completion. Okay, so what do we mean by this? This is really a measure of how complex, how difficult the actual assignment was. Was the trainee able to initiate this on their own? Were they required to draw on multiple knowledge sources to be able to perform this assignment? Or was it really just a tick box exercise where the trainee was going and following a set of instructions? Okay, someone else has decided what to do, the trainee is just following those orders. That's foundational task completion. Whereas a situation where the trainee is actually making the decisions about what has to be done in the work assignment, and the trainee is taking responsibility for doing that work, that's then a more advanced measure of task completion. Task understanding, again, in the context of the assignment. What do we mean by task understanding? So we're trying to measure the degree to which the trainee understood the work/professional assignment. And what this is getting us to challenge is, I mean, any assignment that a trainee goes off and completes, they're obviously going to be producing output from that assignment, okay, whatever the assignment is. This question then is around, do they know what to do with that output, that outcome from the assignment they've just completed? So it's kind of like asking the question, you go and perform the assignment, now what? What do you do with the result? Do trainees have sufficient understanding of that assignment to know what to do with the outcome? Are they able to then use the outcome to then make decisions, to decide what needs to happen next, to recommend what should happen next? Or are they coming to you and saying, look, I've just done this assignment, this is what I've found, but I have no idea what to do with it. I don't know what this means. I don't know what to do with this information I've just obtained. Okay, so that measure of task understanding is about the degree to which the trainee understands the work assignment in sufficient depth to be able to then take the outcome forward. Foundational understanding would be a situation where the trainee only has a key understanding of core principles related to that work assignment, but they don't really know what to do with the outcome. whereas more advanced task understanding is a situation where the trainee knows exactly what to do with the outcome of what they've just done. They know what to do from there. They know how to use that information to go forward. The fourth dimension is then referencing to degree of dependency. This is to do with the degree to which the trainee assumes responsibility for the quality predominantly of the output they produce. So, and again, it's a reference to the work assignment. Are they sufficiently comfortable with the work assignment that they can do their own checks and balances around what they're producing? Are they able to double check the content of what they're producing? Are they taking responsibility for the content being correct, appropriate, thorough? Or are they dependent on someone else to come in and do that double check on what they've done? This is not part of the whole, review of work performed process. The generation of review notes, review queries, feedback about the assignment that's just been completed. It's prior to that. So before the trainee hands the work in to be reviewed, do they take responsibility for the quality of the work? Or do they just rely on the natural review process to pick up the problems with the quality of the work? Clearly, where they're dependent on others to double check the quality, that's a foundational level of dependency. Whereas if they're not dependent on others and they assume responsibility for the quality of the work they produced, that's then the more advanced proficiency in terms of this task dependency. Okay, so those are the four questions. Just a note here, when you look at the decision tree, you'll notice that to be able to achieve level 3 proficiency for an acumen, the only one of these 4 dimensions that needs to be advanced is guidance. The other 3, if the task completion, task understanding, task dependency, if those are assessed to be at intermediate level, the trainee will still be able to achieve a level 3 proficiency. Okay, so advanced guidance, but with intermediate task completion, intermediate task understanding, and intermediate dependency, that will all result in an advanced rating of proficiency. Okay, it's just the way the decision tree has been set up. Okay, so from a PDS point of view, what then happens? We apply these dimensions in the LOR, the trainee rates themselves, it goes to the reviewer confirms the rating, and then these ratings get sucked into the PDS decision. Much like in the old training program, where the ratings of technical competence and the rating of the other professional skills got accumulated in the ANA. Okay, so in the PDS, we now have these ratings coming in for the acumen. Now what we're doing is considering literally just 2 things. And it's really around, is there enough evidence? So we ask the first question, are there any level 3 ratings coming through? If there aren't, well then are there any level 2 ratings coming through? If there aren't, well then are there any level 1 ratings coming through? Once we've determined that we've got evidence coming in at a certain level, then we ask whether that constitutes sufficient evidence at that level. Okay, so we've got a level 3 rating coming in from an LOR, but there's just 1. If we now go and say, well, would that constitute sufficient evidence to suggest the trainee can continue to operate at an advanced level? We might be answering, no, there's only 1 rating coming through. I would want more evidence of level 3 proficiency in LORs before I'm comfortable that this trainee is able to continue to operate at level 3. Okay, so we're not asking the questions at PDS level about the guidance and the task completion, the task understanding, and the dependencies. Those are all asked at LOR level. Those determine the rating of proficiency in the LOR. Now those scores are pulled through, and we're now considering the sufficiency of evidence at those LOR levels. Okay, like with the PVAs, we do have a final question. So let's say, for example, we've got 1 score coming in of level 3. So there is a level 3 rating coming in. We then say, well, is there sufficient evidence to suggest they can continue at level 3? No, there's just one. So we'd then be heading to a level 2 rating at the PDS. Okay, the last question we asked then is there anything else to suggest that the trainee would not then be able to continue at level 2? Okay, so we've asked the first 2 questions and we've got to a level. Now we're saying, anything else to take into account? I mean, say for example, you know, the evidence coming through is a level 3 rating from one example, a level 1 rating from another example, a level 2 rating from a third example. Okay, so now this comes into the PDS. Is there level 3 evidence? Yes, there is, one of them. Okay, is there sufficient evidence to suggest they could continue at level 3? No, there's only one score. I want more evidence before I give this a level 3. So then in terms of the decision tree, I'd have to go to level 2. Then I asked the last question, is there anything else I should be taking into account? Well, that 3, 2, 1, what about the sequence in which that went? What if it started with a 3, then went to a 2, then went to a 1? Well, I'm not sure that there isn't other information now to suggest they wouldn't be able to continue at level 2, because the latest evidence that's come through was actually a level 1. So what I might then do is say, yes, there is additional information to suggest they can't continue at level 2. There's just not consistency in the ratings. Therefore, I'm going to award the level 1 rating. Okay, and that's how we use the PDS decision tree. I mean, obviously, these 3 decision trees are in that PDF document that you've been given. What I wanted to do was just make you more familiar with the questions that are asked and how we then use these decision trees to then go and achieve a rating of proficiency. So just to come back to the question that Riza raised in the chat function earlier, and I think it was a good question. You know, and this will come back to your expected levels of proficiency document in your training office plan. When you're going and setting what level of proficiency do you expect trainees to be achieving as they progress through their training contract? So often I see, in my opinion, mistakes being made where training officers award too high a rating of proficiency too soon in the training contract term. And I mean, take the PVAs, for example. You know, you take something like personal integrity. And what I think people are thinking is, like, personal integrity, that's like super critical. I mean, trainees need to display personal integrity from the get-go. So our expectation is kind of like exit level proficiency from the very beginning. And they then go and attach expected levels of proficiency of a 3 to PDS period 1. But be careful here. Because remember, that expected rating of proficiency is dependent on frequency of demonstration and complexity of the situation they were in when they displayed that behavior. And I would just argue in the early stages of a training contract, there's no way frequency or complexity are going to be at an advanced level. So by you going and setting an expected proficiency of a 1 at the end of the first 6 months, don't make the mistake of thinking that implies that we're not expecting trainees to display personal integrity. Of course we are. It's just that 6 months in, there won't be a lot of evidence, and the situations in which they displayed the evidence are going to still be pretty straightforward. So it's appropriate to be setting a level 1 expectation 6 months into the training contract term. The same thing might be true of the acumen. You know, it's just that in that early stages of the training contract, there's unlikely to be sufficient evidence to support high levels of expected proficiency early on in the training contract term. Okay, so I thought it might be an idea to actually, having gone through this discussion with you, to then just work through an example of how we might apply this stuff we've been talking about. So let me give you an example, and we'll then run through it in terms of the impact of this on the LOR and the impact on the PDS. So I've given you a pretty generic example here. So you give your trainees a work assignment, a professional work assignment, and you get them to team up with a colleague, and you want them to go and do some research on an emerging issue, and you want them to present the results of that research to the office so that everyone can learn from that. and be more informed about whatever this emerging issue is. Okay, so that's the professional assignment you've given to your trainee. So first off, if we look at the context to this, in the LOR, trainees are having to go and describe the technical context. It's the base, the platform from where they then go and display the behaviors and demonstrate their use of the acumen. So in our example, the technical context is this. It's the conducting of research on this particular emerging issue. That is the assignment that the trainee is going to be busy with. Okay, just note, it's a professional in-house project rather than necessarily going off and performing work in a business unit or at a client. And that's fine. Okay, there's not a requirement that technical context must be what you do at a client or what you do in a business unit in terms of actual technical work. Okay, it's broad. So we're talking professional work context. And these internal assignments or projects are just as relevant as any technical work assignment. The point that Andre made in the chat earlier, though, is when recording this context, you must be able to link the context to at least one technical learning outcome. I don't think in our example that would be difficult. I mean, what is this emerging issue that they're doing research on? Is it a change in tax legislation? Is it possibly a change in statutory legislation, accounting frameworks, accounting standards? Is it a change in thinking around business strategy? I mean, whatever the emerging issue is, it's going to be able to be linked to their ability to use certain technical learning outcomes. And the trainees will need to make that association in the electronic assessment tool. Okay, so this is the starting point. We record the context which trainees are then going to use to display their behaviors, the PVAs, and the use of the acumen. So which PVAs could potentially be demonstrated within this particular context? And I mean, just by way of example, and there could be many of these, personal integrity might be something that could be demonstrated. Honesty in terms of how they approach the research, in terms of how they use the findings, in terms of what they consider, what they exclude. There might be an ability to display personal ethics through this context. Professional ethics in terms of things like competence and due care. If they're doing a research project on an emerging issue, are they exercising due care in terms of what information they're obtaining, where the information comes from? Are they corroborating evidence rather than just relying on a single point of view? That may be an opportunity to display due care. Maybe even lifelong learning, their own self-development. I mean, they're going out to do this research to learn more about this emerging issue. They're going to be able to display this behavior, their ability to develop themselves, to learn more about emerging issues. So with these PVAs then, once they've identified which PVAs they've displayed, and again, this could be any of the 21 PVAs, and it can be more than one, they would then need to go along and document the display of these PVAs in their LOR. So this is where they'll then go and describe their behavior. How did they use that PVA? Referring back to Sandra's conversation with you earlier, this is where they need to then be specific, detailed display and understanding of the particular PVA that they're demonstrating. They would also need to, and again, Sandra made this point and I've emphasized it, they would also in the LOR need to then describe the context to this behavior. Was the context foundational, intermediate, or advanced? And they're going to need to apply their minds here. Were they directly responsible for doing the research? Or did someone else tell them what research to go and do, what websites to go and look, what resources to go and access, what videos to go and watch? If someone else told them what to do, then the context is more foundational. But if the trainee took responsibility for doing the research, went and found those resources themselves, then that's a more advanced context. It's a more difficult situation. The trainee isn't able to rely on someone else to tell them what to do. There's more at stake where trainees have these higher levels of responsibility. Okay, so they will describe their use of the PVA and they will describe the context to this research project. Okay, how complex was the nature of this research project? Then for the acumen, my goodness, there could be, I mean, there's 74 to choose from. There are a lot of acumen that could be demonstrated in the performance of something like this research project. Critical thinking, integrated thinking, problem solving. I mean, problem solving, where do I get the information from? What if I can't get the information? What if there's a conflicting view? How do I solve that? Professional skepticism, where does the information come from? How reliable is it? How credible is it? Their ability to communicate, not only with their teammate in doing the research, but their ability to then present the outcome of the research back to the office would imply the use of presentation skills, both communication verbally and possibly in writing. Are they putting together summaries of their research, for example? That's an ability to display an ability to communicate effectively in writing in a professional manner that's clear. Their ability to use people skills, get on with their teammates, work together, resolve problems as they come up. Obviously, their ability to work as part of a team. How do they share the workload? Who's responsible for what? Do they step in and help each other out where they need to? Their ability to manage themselves, prioritizing tasks, timelines, deadlines for deliverables. Are they able to take responsibility for managing that project that they're now doing? And then various user competencies, not least their ability to use presentation software, for example, something like MS PowerPoint, if they're going to use that as an opportunity to then share the results of their research with the rest of the office. Okay, so, this is just a selection. You could probably think of others that would be relevant to this particular professional context. So they now go and highlight which particular acumen they've used. And in the LOR, they again go and describe their behavior. Okay, how did they use the particular acumen? The how, what, why, when, who, being specific, being detailed in their description. And note that one work context, the conducting of research and providing feedback, could be the platform to display numerous acumen. And that's fine. They can add in as many acumen as is relevant. They would then need to describe the 4 dimensions. So they would need to describe the degree to which they were told how to do the acumen. Okay, so if it's teamwork they're using, or problem solving, or integrated thinking, did someone have to tell them how to work effectively in the team, how to apply integrated thinking? They would have to go and describe the level of task completion. So this research project that they've done, did they do this on their own, or were they following instructions of someone else? Okay, so was the task completion foundational, intermediate, or advanced? Was the task, sorry, that should be task understanding. My apologies for the slide there. That level of task understanding. So they go and do the research and they get outcomes from the research. They get answers, they get information. Do they know what to do with the information? Are they able to analyze the information? Are they able to take the information and then put it into a format that can then be communicated to others? Okay, if they are, that's displaying advanced task understanding. If they're not able to do that, they need someone else to tell them how to then communicate this information or what this information means. That's then more foundational task understanding. And then lastly, around the dependencies. Did they assume full responsibility for the quality of the outcome they produced? Or was someone coming in and checking that they've done the right stuff, enough stuff, they've got the right information before they then go and present it to the training office? Okay, so to what level were the dependencies foundational through to advanced? Once they've done that rating, they will then obviously submit that to the reviewer. The reviewer will corroborate the PVA and the acumen evidence. They will confirm their happiness with the rating that's been awarded. And then if we go to the PDS level, now at the moment, there would just be, for the nominated PVAs, we know about their demonstration of one PVA in that particular context. So the evaluator assesses now having to look at whether there's other evidence. I mean, to be able to measure frequency, how often was the display demonstrated? Okay, so there was evidence around personal integrity for this research project. But if that's the only evidence for personal integrity, then at the PDS level, we don't really have much other than foundational frequency being displayed. But if there are other examples of their display of personal integrity, then we can get to a point where we're starting to get more and more frequent display, and we start then getting to a point where the proficiency levels become higher. At the PDS level, they will also take into account the context for each submission of their ability to display personal integrity, to then go and make a decision about, from a holistic point of view, are we comfortable about their ability to display this behavior in more complex contexts? There might be frequent display of the behavior, but the situations may all be simple, straightforward, just following orders. Well, then we're going to have advanced frequency, but foundational context. Okay, and then we'll use the decision tree to then get us to what that means in terms of a rating. For the acumen, we would then have to have a look at the sufficiency of ratings coming through. So we'd have ratings coming through from this LOR, but other LORs, other ratings for these same acumen. How many ratings are there? And in your opinion, is there sufficient evidence, including the research project acumens, but the other evidence as well? Would there be sufficient evidence to suggest the trainee is able to operate at a certain level of proficiency? So just, by way of illustration, I mean, what if it was a fairly easy or limited opportunity to use the acumen? So they're working together. There's just two of them. It's in the early stages of a training contract. It's maybe a fairly simple illustration of teamwork. But when we answer the questions, the trainee didn't need to be guided. So the guidance is advanced. And if the assignment, that research project, for example, was fairly complex, and it may well have been, you might then find that that display of teamwork gets an LOR rating of a 3. Okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're then operating at level 3, because in the PDS, we're going to get this 3 coming through for this work assignment, but now we need to consider what other evidence is coming through. And we need to consider, is there anything to suggest they might not be able to continue at this level? Well, if it's a relatively simple situation, you might not be comfortable that there's enough evidence to suggest they can continue at that level, so you might award the lower rating. Okay, so there's, like in the old training program, there's a fair amount of judgment involved in this process. I do think this is going to take us time to become familiar with. It's taken me a while to get my head around these to a point where I'm comfortable to explain them. And I've spent a lot of time on these. So I can only imagine, for trainees, reviewers, evaluators, assessors, this is going to take time to acquire the ability to do this. There is judgment involved at both the PDS level and the LOR level. And shortly I'm going to hand over to Neo to take you through, the training office review considerations. And I think SAICA completely recognized that this is a steep learning curve for everyone. Obviously, and Sandra's made mention of this as well, the sooner people start to get to grips with this, the more the quality of evidence improves, the quicker the process becomes. But yeah, it is going to take some time to get everyone on the same page. Just see a question in the chat there from Geraldine, mentioning this example, we're rating professional values and attitudes in the LOR, but I thought the professional values will only be rated. Yeah, sorry. So in the professional values, the PVAs, we don't rate in the LOR. We describe the behavior and we describe the complexity of the situation. That then gets submitted for review. There's no rating in the LOR for the PVAs. For the acumen, there would be ratings. So for the acumen, we describe the behavior, we describe the 4 dimensions, and then we use the 4 dimensions to determine a rating of proficiency. When I say we, the trainee does this. Okay, that evidence is then submitted to the reviewer. The reviewer then corroborates the evidence and the rating. But you're 100% right. The PVAs, we only determine proficiency ratings at PDS level because we can only consider frequency of demonstration at a PDS level. So yeah, I apologize if I miscommunicated that. Okay, and good people, that is pretty much me done for my role in this. I'm then going to hand over to Neo to take you through two different slides. The first of those to give you just a status update on where SAICA sits with the implementation of CA 2025. And then secondly, to take you through the implications of CA 2025 on the training office review process. So Neo, over to you to talk to the implementation of CA 2025.
Thanks, Graham, for the session thus far, to yourself also and to Sandra. I think it's been quite informative thus far. So in terms of the journey, in terms of CA 2025, in terms of how far we are, initially when I joined, there was the 30th of June deadline. And then before then, Mandy had communicated, I think in consultation with the TPSC, that there is need for an extension. Hence, there was the latter extension, which was the 31st of August, whereby I'd still ask if a training office has requested or hasn't requested necessarily to get an extension, please reach out to us and actually just indicate. So far, we've granted everybody an extension in terms of if you have any matters that would be affecting you as a training office. Then I think in top of that is that we're trying to see what are the critical issues and where can we actually respond on and so forth. I think the team has been quite with, especially on the EAT side, there's been quite an extensive amount of support that we've tried to give to the training officers. We really do understand this far in terms of the journey and moving through. So currently in terms of the offices that have uptaken or we've had in terms of the electronic assessment tool, we've invited 696 officers thus far. So meaning that you would have gotten an invite for you to actually start the onboarding process for the EAT tool. So what we also got is that initially there was a massive problem with some of the emails. So we've tried to sort that out. And if you haven't gotten the invite, please come back to us because we've seen some training offices, they might be utilizing personal email addresses that are contradictory to what we have on the TCMS system. So we would utilize the database, which would be the TCMS information and try to, but yeah, within the team, we're trying to resolve some of those matters and trying to improve in terms of responding on that. Then also in terms of support that we have, what we've seen is that we have upskilling training that we have available as a resource and as support for the training officers for various role players within the assessment process. And I just want to speak on the numbers. So far, we've got 9,000 or just over 9,700, it might be higher today, tokens that we've got issued for the upskilling training. So we've seen that we're issuing tokens out, but not necessarily, there's still in terms of utilization of people that are actually utilizing the training on the Pro Beta website. There's still a miss in the correlation from the tokens we've issued and how many people are actually utilizing the training. Because when you see there's various trainings there'll be a training, the upskilling training for the trainee, upskilling training for the reviewer, upskilling training for the evaluator, then also for the training officer. And then at the end of each training, you would actually get a certificate to indicate you have done that training. And you can do this training online at your own leisure. So I understand sometimes due to work commitments, it might be difficult to even do it during working time, but we're encouraging all the officers, please to try and make time for the necessary trainings because we've seen a number of officers that haven't necessarily taken up those support initiatives that we have. Then also, Tanya had quite an extensive amount of guidance that she did with her videos explaining in terms of the CA 2025 process. And there's also a number of guidance documents that we have from the actual framework templates. And all of that is on the SAICA website under the CA 2025 under trainees and training officers. So please also check within that part of the our SAICA website for that. And then also these consultations that we have, these free consultations in terms of drawing up your training plan, where we've got set consultants that can actually help you on the process of when you're drawing up and drafting your training plan, which is up to an hour. So even that we've seen, I think utilization was just underneath 100 that had utilized it, and we've got about 700 officers. So there's still a high number of officers that are not utilizing the support mechanisms that are put in place. And I'd like to encourage everybody, if they can try as soon as possible, to get on the EAT system, because once you're on the EAT, I see Lunga's already even putting some of the support details, is that we've got the even, we call it the help center or the help function in terms of our Zendesk, whereby we can see and even ticket each query and respond to it, and you can actually measure it. And there's been better responsiveness and in terms of taking out issues and resolving them when you utilize the EAT platform. And also in the help desk, you'll see that there's actually quite a community whereby common matters or FAQs on certain issues that you might be experiencing, you can get a responsiveness on that, because there's even a bot that's put in that can try to do that within the EAT. Graham, if I can go to the next slide just to speak on the reviewers. Thanks. So I think Graham has really reiterated in terms of SAICA's stance, in terms of the SAICA review and our process in terms of accreditation, that our intention is that we would have leniency in terms of this process and the implementation, because we understand the challenges and we understand the change that's required from your side as a training office, and from our side in terms of understanding what's the issues that you're experiencing. So from our side, there's a large extent, even when we have engagement with our with our SAICA reviewers, is that it has to be a collaborative effort in terms of seeking also to assist the training officers. So it shouldn't necessarily be punitive at this stage whereby we're trying to affect your risk rating. It's a matter of trying to see how do we work together to try and resolve some of these matters, and also get you in terms of understanding CA 2025. Firstly, ensuring how far are you in the journey, what have you utilized, what are the issues that you are experiencing in some of these matters. And then definitely, I think there would be flexibility that we granted around the training plans, because we've seen some people might have matters regarding the training plans. And also initially when we said,
Neo's lost some connectivity there. I think what I can do is speak to these points. Hopefully Neo will come back on again and get things going. Could I suggest this may be something to do with load shedding and our friends at Eskom? But yeah, just to reiterate Neo's point there, and I can speak to this as chairman of the training program subcommittee, because we give guidance and work with the review team in relation to these training office visits. And there's very much this viewpoint of the need to be flexible. So it's not, we don't expect to be raising findings where there are elements around CA 2025 that perhaps are not completely as they should be. The role of the reviewer is going to be to assist you in getting CA 2025 up and running. SAICA recognizes the steep learning curve. So, if your office training plan is not completely right or could be improved, that feedback is going to come through to you, but you're not going to end up with something like that affecting the risk rating of the training office. So I imagine, SAICA will make a call in terms of for how long do they introduce this degree of leniency and flexibility. Certainly in terms of the foreseeable future, certainly through to the end of this year, I expect the leniency and flexibility to be there. I think once there's been a reasonable amount of time given to training officers to implement CA 2025, then I imagine SAICA will start expecting more. And I imagine from that point on, where things aren't happening, then start introducing the findings. But certainly in terms of the content of office training plans, the recording of catch-up evidence from before you go live, and even that first PDS meeting, I mean, for many of you, if you're going with 31 August and you had trainees that started in January this year, that 6-month PDS cycle is already gone by the time you come to 31 August. So what we've seen in some instances is training officers choosing to even meet offline for the PDS. Go through, have a conversation with the trainee, encourage them to start submitting and accumulating evidence than submitting. Have a discussion about the training program, give clarity about the training program, answer questions the trainee might have about the training program, and just keep a record of that meeting. So that first PDS meeting might not even happen in the EAT. And again, SAICA will give flexibility around that. Okay, so yep, I think then our final conversation is to hand over to Lunga, just to take us through a couple of issues at a fairly high level around onboarding. I've seen the questions coming through in the chat function around the onboarding and the going live, and Lunga's been great in responding to those. So let me now give you the ability to hear it straight from the source. Okay, Lunga, over to you to take us through some of these EAT implementation issues.
Afternoon, Graham, and afternoon to everyone. Thanks for the session as well. The information has been quite informative that you and Sandra have provided. So what I'm going to go through is just some of the issues that we have picked up on the support side of the EAT that might assist the training officers on onboarding process go a bit quicker and smoother. So I'm going to start with onboarding of trainees. When we first started onboarding training officers, we picked up that a lot of role players such as reviewers, evaluators, assessors were being invited incorrectly onto the EAT. The EAT is a two-step or two-system. You need to use two systems to invite your trainees. So the process would start on TCMS, with you inviting your trainees via TCMS and then activating them in the EAT. Only trainees may be invited via TCMS. And if any of the training officers have any trainees that were invited incorrectly using TCMS, they may contact us and request us to amend those users on the EAT. Or if you already invited trainees that are going to remain on the 2016 program, you can contact us to remove them off of the EAT, so that it makes things much easier when viewing the trainee profile. When it comes to inviting of trainees, we urge the training officers to just check on TCMS as well, that the information that they are producing is correct. We have put in place validations on TCMS that won't allow you to invite the trainee if their details don't match what's in the SAICA database, mainly things like your email address, because we've picked up that the email address has been one of the main concerns when it comes to inviting trainees and having that error on TCMS when you're inviting your trainees. So I'm going to move on to invited. The other role players are all invited on the EAT itself. So if you navigate to the EAT on the administrations tab, you'll see that there's an add new user button there. All other role players such as your reviewers, evaluators, assessors, training office administrators, and moderators would be invited through the EAT. All you need is their 8-digit SAICA ID. As soon as you populate the open field, it will pick up the person's details. you would just need to confirm that the details that appear below are correct, especially the email address, as the EAT would send the invitation email to the email that's been saved in the SAICA database. How you can resolve this, the first step would be you can update your own email either through TCMS or the members portal. And if you are still struggling with updating your email, you can send an email to the support emails that I've provided in the chat for assistance with those issues. When it comes to the other role players, your trainees won't be able to assign an LOR to a reviewer that's not been assigned to the training office yet. So you just need to ensure that all role players are invited into your office, and that will also assist the trainees in being able to assign the various reviewers or assessors and evaluators to the LORs or RPL. The first thing that you would need to do in the EAT when it comes from a trainee's perspective would be to activate when activating your trainees would be selecting an assessment start date. Kindly note that the assessment start date for every trainee is not the date, is not linked to their assessment or the contract start date. It's the date in which that they will be. It's the date in which they will be assessed on the EAT itself. So you can have a different date to what the trainee's contract start date is. So in certain instances, you might find that the trainee's contract start date, for example, is January the 1st at the beginning of the year. However, the trainee only received access to the EAT itself in the beginning of July. You can still put July 1st as their assessment start date, because that would be the date in which they were invited and they would start being assessed on the EAT. And for the periods that would have passed from January to June, that can also, you can do an RPL or do LORs and just name them with the different months, as the EAT doesn't allow you to backdate LORs on the system. In terms of using the tool itself has inbuilt guidance. There's a tab that says Help Center. When you navigate to the Help Center, you'll see that there's guidance that's been provided, where we tried splitting up the different guidance into roles. So you can navigate to your specific role as a reviewer, evaluator, or trainee and view guidance that's specific to what you would be doing on the EAT. We do encourage you to provide us with feedback on the actual guidance that's there. There's a comment section that's available there where you can provide us with feedback on what we can improve or change on our guidance, or just provide clarity on certain sections related to the guidance that's there. We also have a Help Center, a help button at the bottom right hand part of the screen. The help button will allow you, is linked to the Help Center as well, so you can type in any questions that you might have regarding the EAT. If the question isn't available in the Help Center, it will allow you, the system will allow you to have a chat in real time with a support person on the other end. Each time you send a message through the chat function, it automatically logs a ticket on SAICA's side that we would attend to. And it also helps the office as well to keep track of any issues that are open in their training office, and to know that SAICA is indeed looking into their issues and will respond. We currently have a high volume of tickets and requests on both platforms. It's because we have just onboarded, or a lot of people started onboarding before the deadline and started using the EAT then. So we do have quite a number of tickets coming in. However, if you haven't received a response, you should receive a response within at least 8 hours. We are also working on further guidance to to clarify things such as your assessment start date, which date to select, as well as how does the RPL work, and we will inform the officers once the guidance has been published regarding those matters. There is also sessions that we host weekly where you can join in on those sessions or set up a session with an individual session for your office, only where we can sit for an hour and go through any issues that you might have related to the EAT. In my experience, since we started onboarding training officers, those that have set up sessions, one-on-one sessions, or have joined the group sessions that we have understood how to use the EAT better, and some of the issues have been they've been able to get better clarity while having a virtual call with myself and Neo and some of the support team members, where we go through the EAT with you tab by tab and we explain what each of those individual tabs do. We have received feedback regarding future upgrades on the tool, or if additional features can be added, such as exporting of reports on the EAT, as well as certain filters that training officers have advised that would be very useful for them when assessing trainees' information that they've provided or evidence that they've provided. We have started working on a few of those additional features on the EAT, and we'll notify you once they've been available. However, we do encourage you to send us emails with suggestions on what you feel that would be best on the EAT and would help you as a training office use in using the EAT. One other matter I'd like to cover is the upskilling tokens. Please email assess@saica.co.za to request tokens, as well as if you haven't received your onboarding invitation. We have sent out invitations, but we did pick up that some of the invitations went to either a Gmail or a Yahoo email address that was set up prior to them being invited onto the EAT. So now what you would do is you would just send us an email with your training office name and the training officer's name, the training officer's SAICA ID, and we would be able to just verify that the email is correct and resend the invitation to you. One other thing that we would like to stress is we would like, if you are making use of the chat function within the EAT itself, we would like you to just put in a description of which training office you are from and your SAICA ID. It just makes things much easier when we are doing support on our end, instead of us doing the back and forth trying to find out which training office you are from. There's a fix that will, or an additional feature that we'll have shortly that will allow us to view those details. However, currently we do rely on you providing us with that information upfront when you are making use of the help center, just so that we know which office you are from and what your SAICA ID is. That's everything from my side, and thank you. I will make sure that I respond to any of your questions in the chat, or alternatively, you can send them to the support emails that I just provided.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that update, Lunga. Yeah, exciting times. Look, I understand there's obviously a big change for everyone, and this need to adapt and into something that's a fundamentally different training program, new electronic assessment tool. But I don't know, I think I echo Sandra's comment from earlier. It's exciting times to be involved in. I genuinely believe the 2025 training program is a big improvement. I think we're heading in the right way in terms of how we're generating these future members of the profession. And I must say, from the EAT perspective, I've been quite impressed so far, for what that's worth. But I think, as Lunga pointed out, and I think that's important, SAICA are going to be constantly taking feedback on the EAT, and then at regular intervals, contracting AssessCat to go along and make the amendments to the EAT. So the more feedback SAICA gets about any hassles you have, any things that could be done more efficiently, send the information through to Lunga. He'll then note it, and then when there is the opportunity to consider that as a possible upgrade to the system, it can then be implemented going forward. Good people, from a time management point of view, I think we've done quite well. It's 12:20, and that does bring us to the end of the session. I do think we've managed to respond to the questions, and thank you to Sandra and Lunga and Neo for stepping in and responding to questions as they come through. What we will do as a team afterwards, we'll just go back and double check that there aren't any questions from earlier on, for example, that we haven't managed to respond to. And if we do pick up anything like that, we'll then come back to you individually. But I do think just in following the chat, we have been able to respond to the questions. Just also remember those contact information that Lunga sent through in terms of the assess@saica.co.za email address. And obviously Neo as your prime point of contact at SAICA to assist you in this process. But for me, what I find really encouraging is SAICA's recognition that this is a steep learning curve, and SAICA really wanting to work with training officers to implement this new program. So good people, before I just hand over to Neo just to give a final farewell, and maybe just to add any final comments before he was so rudely kicked off the session by Eskom. Just from my side, I'd like to really thank you so much for your giving up of your 4 hours to spend with the four of us. I hope you found the session valuable. What I'm going to do just before I hand back to Neo, just to wrap everything up, in the chat box, I'm just going to post a link here to a Microsoft Forms document. If you really wouldn't mind taking just a couple of minutes, it really won't take more than 5 minutes at the longest, and we are running ahead of schedule. So if you could please just click on that hyperlink, it'll open up the Microsoft Forms survey, and if you could please complete that, we would greatly appreciate it. Neo, let me hand over to you as the top dog in SAICA responsible for this training program, perhaps just to wrap up the session, and we can then bring it to a close.
Thanks, Graham. Apologies once more for breaking up initially. Yeah, I came actually to the office thinking that I'll have a stable connection, then when load shedding hits, then the VPN shuts down. So I'd just like to still thank everybody within the call. I understand there's a number of matters that you might have reached out to us, and as Lunga has indicated, we are trying to respond on all those matters. What we've seen is that every time we have a training office communication, we get almost a bit of a couple of hundreds responses or matters back, but we'll endeavor on our side to try respond to everything. And if we haven't, please just send us a follow-up. We'll try to ensure that we are available, and if you need a one-on-one, we'll try to make time on our side. But other than that, thanks from also to Graham, Sandra. I think it's been invaluable with today's session. We really learned a lot, and we'll continue in terms of the journey. Also thanks to my colleague Lunga. I think him and Lufef are doing a terrific job in terms of the EAT and the support that they're giving towards everyone. Okay, thanks, Graham.
Awesome, thank you, Neo. And thank you once again, everyone. I will then bring the session to a close. You will be sent links to the recording, which will be loaded onto the Click to Start platform. Slides were sent out with the initial invite, so just go double check. But if you do need a copy of the slides, just let us know and we'll happily send them through to you. But otherwise, wishing you all a fantastic rest of your day. I will then bring the meeting to a close and you can go off and do some real work.